I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Greetings, fellow multiversal adventurers. It's an honor to have you back in the saga that has us all hooked. Official channel statement: this story is 100% epic fiction. So please don't attempt real magic, the results aren't guaranteed and insurance won't cover it. The rights to this masterpiece belong entirely to its brilliant original author. We are just a barge sharing it with you. Do you want to keep being part of this amazing community? Join our ninja army of subscribers on YouTube and give this content a like. And for true fans, our Patreon has exclusive ninjutsu waiting for you. Chapter 376: Temporary Defense Line. Tank development and design don't necessarily require being strong in everything. Being strong in everything also means being a jack of all trades and master of none. Tank design must be targeted, as exemplified by the German Upper Silesia tank. Its target was clear: the French Char A1. Discussions at a meeting organized by Major General Luca at the German 7th Transport Department included: does this tank need very thick armor? No, that would only slow it down, and it would be easily defeated by the Char A1 on the battlefield, just like the A7V. To avoid this, its speed must reach at least 12 km per hour, and even higher in extreme cases. The armor thickness is only required to stop ordinary bullets. After all, the French don't have anti-tank rifles. The cannon must be able to penetrate the Char A1's frontal armor, have a high rate of fire, and most importantly, have a rotating turret like the Char A1. After repeated discussions and extensive testing, the Upper Silesia tank was finally completed. 14 mm thick armor, barely enough to stop ordinary rifle bullets. With a top speed of 12 km per hour, and capable of reaching 16 km per hour in extreme conditions, the Char A1 would not be a sitting duck for the A7V tank, which travels at 15 km per hour. In critical moments, it could potentially gain the upper hand at 16 km per hour. Its main gun is a 57 mm rapid-fire cannon, capable of penetrating the Char A1's 25 mm frontal armor at 300 meters. Two heavy machine guns, one in front and one behind, are used for tank protection and trench warfare. Note: the front machine gun on the Upper Silesia is quite reasonable. It's equivalent to a modern tank's bow machine gun. Using a cannon is inappropriate when a tank is dealing with enemy infantry attempting to approach. This is where machine guns come in. The rear machine gun is less practical. Rear protection could be achieved through infantry coordination. However, given the immaturity of tank infantry cooperation during World War I, this design is not surprising. If the Char A1 tank, without any modifications, were to collide with the German 1st Tank Division, it might have been Char's first defeat, and a crushing one at that. This wasn't because the Upper Silesia tank had a larger caliber gun, but because of the tactics employed by Major General Nicholas based on the situation of enemy and friendly tanks. Upon receiving the tanks, Major General Nicholas meticulously compared the data at the Char A1 and concluded: while the Upper Silesia tank's gun caliber is larger than the Char A1, its armor thickness is far inferior, therefore, their penetration distances should be roughly the same, and we won't gain any advantage. The advantage of our tanks is their machine guns equipped with K rounds. Once the Upper Silesia passes by enemy tanks or even circles behind them, the machine guns can attack their weak side and rear armor. The Battle of Cambrai immediately validated Major General Nicholas's ideas. At this moment, the enemy and friendly tanks were passing by. The two machine guns of the Upper Silesia had already turned to the flanks, and as they approached, they suddenly roared to life. Amidst a series of clanging sounds, the side armor of the Saint Chamond was hit at close range by volleys of K rounds. To reduce weight, the Saint Chamond had its side armor reduced to 15 mm, precisely the thickness through which German K rounds could penetrate, if not completely. Thus, some Saint Chamond tanks slowly came to a stop, their crews likely riddled with bullets. Others, however, continued advancing and firing as if nothing had happened. This was the most terrifying aspect. The tank crews, operating amidst thick smoke and noise, were completely unaware of what was happening or the danger. They continued firing shell after shell, the fumes filling the entire tank compartment, obscuring even their targets. Christine, leading the infantry from the rear, was shocked. The German tank's main armament was machine guns. These could penetrate the Saint Chamond's side armor, and of course, the Saint Chamond M21's 13 mm side armor, not to mention the 8 mm rear armor. Continuing to advance was suicidal. Without hesitation, Christine shouted, Halt. Organize a defense. He ultimately disobeyed the order to attack and switched to defense. This was originally difficult, especially switching tanks from an offensive to defensive posture. Fortunately, the Saint Chamond M21s were slow, allowing soldiers to easily catch up and relay Christine's orders. Soon, the Saint Chamond M21s, moving at full speed like snails, came to a stop, forming a defensive line in front of the infantry. Machine guns and 37mm cannons were aimed at the German tanks engaged in combat with the heavy Saint Chamonds. Then, the infantry rushed forward to fill the gaps between the tanks, setting up mortars and preparing grenades to repel the German tank charge. Boom boom boom, the Saint Chamond M21's 37mm cannons opened fire. To everyone's surprise, they actually penetrated the German tanks. Several German tanks slowly came to a stop under the artillery fire. Two of them, likely hit by their ammunition magazines, exploded instantly, their turrets blown off. They tumbled through the air in flames and smoke before crashing back to the ground, tank parts and debris scattered nearby. This boosted Major General Christine's confidence. He brandished his sword and shouted, "Fire! Destroy them!" Bullets and shells rained down on the enemy tanks, startling the German tanks. They abandoned their charge against the lines and instead used their maneuverability to circle around the heavy Saint-Monds, firing at them. This tactic was clever. It would make the French troops behind them hesitant to fire, as shells could easily hit secondary vehicles that were engaged in melee combat with the Saint-Monds. However, the heavy Saint-Monds seemed no match for the German tanks. They were slow, had poor awareness of their surroundings, and lacked turrets, making timely attacks impossible. Just like the Charles A1s circling the AV-7 tanks before, one after another, they were destroyed by the German tanks. They passed peacefully because they were destroyed not by artillery but by machine guns. The process was without explosions or flashes. At most, faint smoke emanated from the craters. Sometimes, survivors wearing gas masks could be seen escaping, billowing smoke as soon as they opened the hatches, but that was mostly smoke from the 75mm guns firing. The heavy Saint Chamond tanks were almost entirely destroyed. One after another, they were destroyed by German tanks during the advance. Of the more than 100, only 7 managed to return. This was thanks to a defensive line organized by Major General Christine in the rear. Otherwise, even those 7 wouldn't have made it back. In fact, this was also because the Germans lacked combat experience in their first battle. They didn't understand the Saint Chamond M21 tanks blocking their path and were intimidated by the hastily constructed French defensive line of tanks and infantry. If the German troops recklessly drove their Upper Silesia tanks forward under a hail of bullets, the turretless Saint Chamond M21 would be no match for them. Once they broke through the lines and passed by, the Upper Silesia's 2 heavy machine guns would unleash a one-sided massacre on the French troops. Major General Christine knew this well, and thus, seeing the victorious German tanks driving away triumphantly, he secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Only he knew that the hasty order he had just given had pulled everyone back from the brink of death. But this was only the beginning. What was next? Chapter 377. Is it possible for us to survive? Charles was directing the battle from the police training base, but he didn't have much intelligence to process. The staff, communications soldiers, and typists were all rather idle. This was because the air battle was still in a probing phase, with the Germans conserving their strength and not using new aircraft, and Charles was happy to continue maneuvering. Secondly, Joffre had forcibly separated air and ground operations, and Charles only had a general understanding of the Cambrai battlefield. However, Charles did know Cambrai. The Battle of Cambrai had taken place there, where the British concentrated over 200 tanks to launch the first ever tank-based attack on the Germans and achieved victory. Note, after the British victory, due to logistical problems and severe communication issues, the troops urgently needed reinforcements, but friendly forces nearby were unaware of this, resulting in the British being driven back to their original positions by the Germans. Both sides suffered over 40,000 casualties. Human life was truly cheap at this time. A single experimental attack cost over 80,000 lives. The image above shows the Cambrai-Berlin forest, one of the main battlefields of the British offensive. All Charles knew was the intelligence relayed by the pilots. The German troops have reached Cambrai, and they seem to be preparing to attack. Our troops went out of the city to meet them, and they deployed their forces outside the city. Our troops repelled the enemy's attack, but suffered heavy losses. The heavy Saint Chamond tanks were almost completely wiped out. Tigeny listened to this conclusion with a somewhat surprised him, then turned and picked up a photo of the St. Simon M21 on his desk, taken by a pilot. "It surprised me," Tigeny said. "This thing actually stopped the German attack." "It wasn't his doing," Charles replied. "It was the commander, Christine, who promptly switched the offensive to defensive posture." Tigeny considered for a moment and nodded slightly. "In defensive mode, the disadvantage of the St. Simon M21 without a turret isn't so obvious," Charles grunted in agreement. "They had narrowly escaped death, otherwise, the battle would have been incredibly brutal, with at least half of the French 1st Special Artillery Division losing their lives." Now, Charles had what he wanted to know. The 37mm gun could penetrate the German new tank from the front at a known distance of 150 meters. The German new tank had a speed of around 10 kilometers per hour, possibly faster. The German tank's tactic was to use machine guns to attack the enemy's side and rear armor. Just then, Charles's phone rang. It was General Winter, who had been following this remarkable victory from Paris. After all, nothing was more important at the moment. "How is it?" General Winter asked. "Are you confident?" "Almost," Charles replied. Tigeny, standing nearby, seemed confused. What did he mean by almost done? General Winter asked again, "How long will it take to prepare?" "1 day? 2 days, 2 days," Charles replied, but then countered, "Do you have a way to transfer command to me?" Charles wasn't doubting General Winter's ability. At this time, Britain still held considerable influence over France, and transferring command to Charles with the resources of a single nation wouldn't be difficult. The challenge was to do it seamlessly and without arousing suspicion. General Winter laughed. "Next comes the British reinforcements, Brigadier General. We have the right to choose our allies." Charles instantly understood and immediately agreed to the plan. As he hung up the phone and looked up, he saw Tigeny's questioning gaze. "What's going on?" Tigeny asked. "Was it something I shouldn't have asked?" "Nothing," Charles calmly replied. "It's time for the 1st Tank Brigade to go." This sounded fine, but what did he mean by when the 1st Tank Brigade goes? Could it be that all of this was part of Charles's plan all along? Then, Tigeny thought about it more deeply, and considering the events that had transpired, he suddenly froze, staring blankly at Charles. After a long while, he smiled and shook his head. "Good heavens, they all fell for your trick, didn't they? The Germans and Joffre?" Charles turned and glared at Tigeny, who immediately stopped talking and raised his hands in surrender. "No, that's not it. I don't know anything." He then smiled meaningfully, leaned close to Charles, and whispered, "I'm glad I'm not your enemy, Brigadier General." In Cambrai, Christine had already led her troops back into the town. This was a last resort. Only in this way could the 1st Special Artillery Division be preserved. However, he had barely settled back into his command post in town when Joffre called. "What happened?" "Why the retreat, General," Christine explained. "We suffered heavy losses. The heavy St. Simons were almost completely wiped out." "I know that," Joffre impatiently interrupted Christine, "but didn't they successfully hold off the enemy?" "Don't we still have the M21s?" Joffre then launched into a tirade of reprimands, his tone furious and merciless. "You missed a chance to win, Christine. Victory could have been achieved simply by launching a full-scale attack. The fact that your defenses held off the German advance proves that. All you had to do was boldly advance, advance, advance. Wasn't my order clear?" Christine was speechless. Did they truly not know what the M21s were? Or were they emphasizing advance and attack even when they did? Christine believed it was the former, because that only indicated poor communication or a lack of understanding of warfare. If it was the latter, then they were pointlessly pushing their soldiers into a fire pit. At that moment, Joffre roared into the microphone, "Now, before the Germans can regain their footing, attack immediately. Don't hesitate. The fruits of victory are right before your eyes, Christine, just waiting for you to pluck them. It's that simple." Christine didn't answer, thinking to herself, "We're the ones who haven't regained our footing, you fool." That fruit of victory might be a bomb. She didn't say it aloud because she knew it was useless. It would only invite another reprimand. However, refusing to obey orders? He would be shot. Obeying orders? He and the 1st Special Artillery Division would all be finished. Christine was in a dilemma. In a moment of urgency, she frowned and said, "General, I will attack, but this time I hope to get air support. So, I need to discuss it with Charles." Joffre desperately wanted victory, a remarkable victory, no matter what, including with Charles's air force. Therefore, Without much thought, she nodded in agreement. As soon as possible. The Germans won't give you that much time. Christine secretly breathed a sigh of relief and ordered the communications officer to send a telegram to Charles. The telegram's message was simple: is it possible for us to survive? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 378 Night Battle. When Charles received the telegram, he was initially taken aback, then realized it was Christine pleading for help. Charles understood Christine's predicament. The capitalists, Schneider, and politicians, Joffre, hoped Christine could lead the Saint Salmon tanks to a resounding victory, bringing them profits. But the Saint Salmon tanks were proving ineffective, especially the Saint Salmon M21, which was utterly useless and a major liability. Thus, a conflict arose. Christine and her 1st Special Artillery Division were caught in the middle between the German forces and Joffre, seemingly facing a dilemma where only total annihilation could prove Joffre wrong. However, what would be the point of proving Joffre wrong then? In the past, Charles would have readily intervened to save them. After all, it was a division, 20,000 lives. But now he hesitated. He had become accustomed to considering and weighing the options from a purely pragmatic perspective. From a reputation and equipment standpoint, they shouldn't be rescued. The more devastating the defeat and the more casualties the 1st Special Artillery Division suffers, the more Charles's command ability and equipment superiority will be highlighted, thus boosting sales of the Charles A1 and maximizing the damage to Schneider and Joffre. However, considering the Army's influence, they should be rescued. Christine is a combat hero, and the officers and soldiers of the 1st Special Artillery Division are elite troops with considerable influence within the Army. If Charles could set aside his conflict with Joffre and rescue them, he would undoubtedly be welcomed and supported by the rank and file. After some consideration, Charles decided the latter was more important. Although the army in France was a force suppressed by politics and capital, it was still a force, and in critical moments, they could often save lives. Charles no longer hesitated. He sent Christine a telegram with only 2 words, night battle. Christine was stunned when she received the telegram. Night battle? What kind of method is that? German tanks lacked night battle capabilities, and neither did theirs. Surely Charles knew this? A sense of disappointment welled up within Christine. She felt humiliated and desolate, to be mocked even on her deathbed. But upon closer reflection, a hint of joy appeared on Christine's face, and her furrowed brow gradually relaxed. If neither side's tanks had night fighting capabilities, it didn't matter whether they were advanced or outdated, whether they had rotating turrets or firepower, none of that mattered, because neither could move or fire. Note, tanks have poor external perception. In the dark, they cannot distinguish friend from foe or see routes, making them almost incapable of combat. Tanks only gain night fighting capabilities after being equipped with night vision devices in modern times. Before that, they could only use tracer rounds to indicate targets, playing a limited role in night combat. Looking at the darkening sky, Christine made up her mind. She first ordered everyone to rest, then found Lieutenant Colonel Gaston, commander of the 2nd Artillery Regiment, Christine's old subordinate and friend. However, Gaston had often clashed with Christine because of his dissatisfaction with the Saint Salmon M21 tank. Gaston often complained to Christine, "I don't think it can be called a tank. What's it besides tracks and a machine gun? A tank should be like the Shire A1. Christine could only reply helplessly, "I know, Gaston, but this is all they gave us. Unless you can build one, there's no other choice." When Christine found Gaston, he was organizing ground crew to repair the Saint Chamond M21. Seeing Christine approach, Gaston gave her a cold look. Wiping the grease from his hands with a rag, he gestured towards the M21 parked by the street. "Look, they're not only slow, but they have a whole host of problems. I even thought about taking those 4 wheels off. If you want, then do it," Christine replied calmly. Gaston sensed something was wrong with Christine's tone and turned to her, asking, "What happened?" Christine gently shook her head. "We're going to attack." Gaston was stunned, asking expressionlessly, "When?" This was practically a death sentence. Christine looked up at the sky and replied, "It'll be dark, about an hour from now." Gaston gritted his teeth, his voice low and menacing. "This is murder, General. Tanks can't fight at night." "I know," Christine replied, glancing around. But this isn't the commander-in-chief's order, it's Charles's. This might be our only chance of survival, Christine spoke softly, but Gaston heard her clearly. Upon hearing it's Charles's order, he shuddered as if pricked by a needle, turning to stare at Christine in shock. "You're insane, General," Gaston exclaimed. "I admit Charles is a military genius, but he's our adversary. Our complete annihilation is in his interest. He'll kill us, he's not that kind of person, Gaston," Christine replied calmly. "Think about it, if our tanks can't fight at night, do you think the enemy can?" Gaston froze, stunned. Christine continued, "At the same time, the Germans know we're a tank force, so they won't expect us to drive tanks into the night for fighting. This might be our only chance of survival, that's true, but," Gaston was still thinking about night fighting capabilities. "Open the hatch," Christine interrupted Gaston. "What?" Gaston stared blankly at Christine. "But that means the enemy can throw grenades into the hatch." Christine looked at Gaston silently. Gaston understood Christine's thinking, between two evils, choose the lesser. To have night fighting capabilities, one had to take risks. The image above shows the hatch of the St. Simon M21 open. This is usually done during road maneuvers to allow for better external detection to match the higher speed. If the hatch is open while the tracks are open, the enemy can easily stuff grenades into the hatch. Finally, Christine asked, "I choose to trust Charles." "What about you?" Gaston considered for a moment and silently nodded. If Charles wanted to kill them, he wouldn't need to offer any advice, he could just wait quietly for the outcome. Besides, Joffre was never to be trusted, never. Christine patted Gaston on the shoulder. "Once the battle begins, don't stop. Full speed ahead, kill everything you can see." In the darkness, friend and foe were indistinguishable, but as long as the tanks maintained a full speed of 6 kilometers per hour, no friendly forces would get ahead of them. This, in fact, became the strength of the St. Simon M21. Its slow speed perfectly matched the infantry's offensive pace, creating a degree of coordination between the two. After instructing the tank regiment, Christine went to inspect the infantry. The only thing he didn't do was return to headquarters to report to Joffre. Christine didn't want any more complications, and even less did he want to face Joffre's true colors at this critical moment. Chapter 379 The Momentum of M21. The croaking of frogs and the chirping of cicadas filled the air, a somber atmosphere. In an open field north of Cambrai, soldiers of the German 1st Tank Division were busy constructing tank bunkers in the setting sun. These bunkers were deep pits similar to trenches, except they had ramps at both ends for the tanks to enter and exit, allowing them to hide in sight and avoid being bombarded by enemy artillery. However, the Germans rarely needed to worry about this, as their 105mm howitzers consistently outmatched the French artillery. After all, those foolish Frenchmen were only interested in 75mm guns. These matters didn't concern Major General Nicholas. He sat on a rock about half his height, staring at his notebook in deep thought. He was satisfied with today's results. At the cost of 13 Alto Silesia tanks, he had destroyed the entire French heavy Saint-Mont regiment, estimated to be over 100 Saint-Mont tanks. However, looking at the sketches of French tanks in his notebook, Nicholas's army was blocked by these small tanks. These tanks even had wheels? What were they for? A new French weapon or a new invention of Charles? Major General Nicholas was utterly perplexed. This was one of the reasons he hadn't ordered his troops to charge the enemy during the day. Those strange wheels puzzled him. Major General Nicholas was completely unaware that he had missed a golden opportunity, a chance to utterly defeat the 1st Special Artillery Division. And the consequences would be severe. The surviving tanks would inflict irreparable damage. As darkness fell, the sketches faded into the shadows, and Nicholas simply closed his notebook and put it in his backpack. He wondered, if he encountered the same enemy defenses tomorrow, should he attack or not? "Erwin," Major General Nicholas called out, turning his head. A tank crewman jogged up to Nicholas and stood up, replying, "General, tomorrow," Major General Nicholas said coldly, "your tank battalion will be at the forefront, charging towards the enemy lines at top speed, understand?" "Yes, General." Erwin readily accepted the mission without hesitation. This was a test. If he succeeded, the main force following behind would surge forward and completely crush the enemy. If he failed, the main force would still have time and space to retreat. However, Major General Nicholas hadn't expected that the enemy wouldn't give him the chance to test the waters tomorrow. Just as Major General Nicholas was considering how to lure the French tanks out of the city the next day, the whistling of artillery shells suddenly filled the air. "Artillery fire!" the sentry shouted, and the soldiers instantly dropped to the ground. Major General Nicholas, however, remained seated, motionless. This wasn't out of bravery, but because he knew the shells wouldn't hit him. Before becoming a tank division commander, Nicholas was an artilleryman. He had commanded 77mm field guns on the front lines against the French more than once. His battlefield experience allowed him to judge the impact point of shells from the whistling sound. They were at least 400 meters away. Sure enough, several shells exploded 500 meters away. Then came another volley of shells, still landing inaccurately. Major General Nicholas was puzzled. Why were the French firing without even seeing his position? 10 minutes passed, and shells continued to explode intermittently, mostly aimless and random. A staff officer rushed to Major General Nicholas and reported, "The artillery can't suppress them. The enemy is using mobile artillery." Mobile artillery meant firing one shell and moving to another. In the darkness, you couldn't pinpoint their next location, making suppression pointless. However, this method also lacked accuracy, as each shell was fired without correction. Major General Nicholas frowned. Why were they wasting ammunition like this? He listened intently, then suddenly understood. The sound of engines was hidden between the artillery fire. "Enemy attack!" Major General Nicholas shouted. "Bring out the tanks." Those were enemy tanks, Major General Nicholas thought. They were using artillery fire to mask the sound of tank engines. The enemy was attacking with tanks. We should counterattack with tanks. However, Major General Nicholas made a mistake in his command. The Upper Silesia was a turreted tank with far inferior external detection capabilities compared to the Saint-Main AM-21. Once inside, the tank crews were practically blind, unable to see anything. Indeed, the tanks barely managed to emerge from their bunkers, then were rendered helpless, staring blankly into the darkness beyond the observation slits. It would have been better to immediately convert to infantry and form a defensive line, using rifles and grenades for defense. Perhaps that would have been more effective. Battlefield victories often hinge on a single decision, and a commander's reaction speed and judgment can determine the outcome. Major General Nicholas seemed to grasp this, but it was too late to change orders. He had no choice but to force his troops to form a defensive line alongside the tanks. Worse still, the German Upper Silesia tanks were tall and imposing, standing like beacons along the German lines, allowing the French to quickly pinpoint the enemy's location and target them. The mortars fired first, shells whistling as they slammed into the German tanks, some even hitting tree branches and exploding overhead, causing German soldiers to scream in agony. A barrage of gunfire followed, the flashes of shells illuminating the German silhouettes, giving the French soldiers a clear target. The Saint-Main M21s maintained their speed as they approached the enemy, the machine gunners peering ahead, their heavy machine guns firing rapidly, unleashing a hail of bullets at the slightest shadow. The Saint-Main M21s, equipped with 37mm cannons, were in no hurry, advancing directly towards the German tanks, closer and closer. The German tanks' machine gun turrets spewed fire, but it was clearly indiscriminate. Bullets were already flying into the air, unnoticed by the Germans. At almost point-blank range, the Saint-Main M21s opened fire with their 37mm cannons. Boom! German tanks billowed white smoke and soon burst into flames. The fires, like torches, illuminated the German lines. Several firemen escaped from the tank compartments, shouting and waving wildly as they ran, creating chaos. The French tanks ignored this, not engaging the Germans in prolonged combat, recklessly accelerating forward, firing at anyone and everything in their path. The entire battle seemed to unfold as if the tanks were at the forefront, disrupting and shattering the German defenses, while French soldiers followed behind, cleaning up the remaining German troops. The Germans, defeated and disoriented, scattered like headless flies, unable to find their way in the darkness. At this moment, the Saint-Main M21 tanks displayed their formidable power. Chapter 380. This might be useful to you. The 1st Special Artillery Division achieved a major victory in Cambrai during a night battle, with the French army retaking lost territory until they reached the original defensive line before stopping. The reason for this halt was that the short tracks of the Saint-Main M21 lacked trench crossing capability, making it impossible for it to cross the 2-meter-wide trenches to pursue the retreating German troops. However, Christine was already satisfied. He had captured a large number of new German tanks, a total of 129, 83 of which were intact and operational. The Germans were caught off guard. In the darkness, they didn't know where to drive their tanks and could only abandon them and flee, not even having time to destroy them before leaving. Commander Gaston of the 2nd Artillery Regiment was overjoyed. He immediately asked Christine, "General, you won't assign the tanks to someone else, will you? There are spoils of war, and I'd love to exchange the Saint Cham for them." "I'm not sure, Gaston," Christine said, gazing at the metal lumps. They did indeed look much better than the Saint Cham M21, even though they were defeated. "You know," Christine said with a hint of helplessness, "we don't have the authority to decide." Gaston's burning gaze gradually dimmed. He thought of a problem. The 1st Special Artillery Division had defeated the Germans with the Saint Cham M21, and the generals sitting in their offices would naturally assume that the Saint Cham M21 was superior to the German tanks. Therefore, these captured tanks were more likely to be assigned to another group of rookies rather than the elite 1st Special Artillery Division. More importantly, only if the Saint Cham M21 remained victorious and wasn't phased out could Schneider legitimately secure more orders. Gaston sighed inwardly. As a tank soldier, owning a normal tank was so difficult. He felt he wasn't fighting the enemy, but rather those foolish generals and greedy capitalists. Christine didn't say anything more. He patted Gaston on the shoulder and reminded him, "You should think more about Charles, Gaston. I hope you understand Charles's sacrifice." With that, Christine left, heading to the defensive line to reinforce the defenses. Gaston stared blankly at Christine's retreating figure. He didn't understand what Christine meant. Charles's sacrifice? He had only offered a suggestion. After a moment of stunned silence, Gaston suddenly realized Joffre was Charles's adversary. Charles helping the 1st Special Artillery Division was helping Joffre. In other words, Charles had helped his opponent defeat him. Only in this way could the lives of the 1st Special Artillery Division's officers and soldiers be saved. When news of the victory reached the French general headquarters, the room erupted in jubilation, with some people excitedly embracing each other in celebration. Joffre, dubbed the French tranquilizer by the media, remained quietly in his seat, though a lump formed in his throat. He desperately needed a victory, not a remarkable one, but even a small, noteworthy win was a luxury. For a long time, Joffre had felt like he lived in Charles's shadow. Every invention and victory of Charles felt like a mountain weighing on his back, suffocating him. Sometimes, Joffre couldn't help but think, why not just resign as commander-in-chief and escape to a faraway place? Charles's presence made this position feel like a burning fire. But he didn't have the courage to give up everything he had. Giving up was tantamount to admitting defeat. He couldn't lose to a child, Joffre thought. Now, victory had finally arrived. He had finally turned the tables. He had proven his ability and that he, as commander-in-chief, was not merely a figurehead. "General," the staff officer reported to Joffre from a few meters away, holding the phone, "General Christine is online. Do you need to say anything to him?" "Yes." Joffre confidently stood up, head held high, and took the receiver, his voice firm and powerful. "Well done, Christine. Just like I said, as long as you dare to attack, you will win." "You have won." Christine on the other end of the line wore a wry smile. This fool still didn't understand that the key to this victory was the night battle, and was still smugly thinking it was all his doing. Christine didn't show it. He seemed to have made a decision and calmly replied, "Yes, General, you're absolutely right." Then Christine added, "I will continue the offensive, but before that, I think we should consolidate the captured lines." "Right." Joffre readily agreed to Christine's suggestion. "I will send reinforcements to relieve them immediately." Finally, Joffre added, "Give my regards to all the soldiers, they are heroes." In the past, Christine might have been moved to tears by these words, but now, only 4 words came to his mind, pale and powerless. If Joffre truly cared about the soldiers on the front lines and truly considered them heroes, he should have considered their lives like Charles did, instead of pushing them into the enemy's guns like garbage. After ending the call, Christine glanced to both sides, picked up the phone again, and lowered his voice, "Connect to the police training base, 105th Infantry Regiment Command." At that moment, the 105th Infantry Regiment Command also received news of Cambray's victory. Tijani nodded to Charles, holding the telegram. "Unbelievable. You only gave 2 words, yet you turned a desperate situation into a glorious victory." "Is there a story behind this?" Charles replied sarcastically. Are you trying to admit you're inferior to Christine? Christine knew what to do upon receiving the words night battle, while Tigany still hadn't figured out the reason. How is that possible? Tigany let out an awkward laugh. He genuinely hadn't expected it. It wasn't that Tigany lacked ability, but rather that he didn't understand the Saint Sham M21, nor did he bother to understand this piece of junk. Because he didn't understand it, it was perfectly normal that he couldn't imagine its advantages in night battles. What Tigany didn't expect was that, under certain circumstances, this junk could play an unimaginable role. Just then, the phone rang. It was Christine calling. Its frontal armor is 14 millimeters, its speed is around 12 kilometers per hour, and its maximum speed is 16 kilometers per hour, Charles grunted in agreement. Then Christine reported, 6.7 meters long, 2.34 meters wide, 2.965 meters high, chassis 0.6 meters off the ground, 1 turret and 2 machine gun turrets, 1 in front and 1 behind. Charles simply replied with an Finally, Christine said, I think this might be useful to you, General. I'll stay with Joffre. Charles smiled slightly and replied, yes, I understand. Charles indeed understood that Christine's last sentence should be reversed. I'll stay with Joffre. I think this might be useful to you. Chapter 381. This is just the beginning. General Winter called Charles, asking suspiciously, what's going on? You taught them how to fight. Charles realized that British intelligence had infiltrated the French army. Otherwise, news of Charles helping the 1st Special Artillery Division win wouldn't have reached General Winter so quickly. Yes, Charles gave a plausible reason. They are the French army, General. General Winter smiled, reminding him, this has nothing to do with me, Brigadier General, but you should know it's not in your interest. Indeed, it had nothing to do with Britain. What he wanted from beginning to end was a remarkable victory, regardless of whether it was won by Joffre or Charles. General Winter simply felt that Charles wasn't mature enough. He still hadn't realized that this was a world driven solely by self-interest, where sympathy, benevolence, and ethics were merely tools to deceive the lower-ranking soldiers and civilians. Charles replied, no, it's in my interest as well. This was Charles's test. What? The voice on the other end of the line was full of doubt. Charles was certain this wasn't feigned. It meant General Winter didn't know Christine had pledged allegiance to Charles. This couldn't get out, at least not now. Then Charles changed the subject, explaining with another reason, you think this battle is over? No, General, this is just the beginning. Indeed, it was just the beginning, and Christine, who is organizing the defenses on the Cambrai line, knew this too. Last night's victory was due to night fighting and surprise attacks, achieved when the enemy was caught off guard. The situation for the 1st Special Artillery Division remained dire. German artillery consistently held the upper hand. Over 50 German tanks escaped, and even without reinforcements, they could still overwhelm the 118 Saint-Mont M21s held by the 1st Special Artillery Division. Although 83 German tanks were captured last night, the French army was unable to utilize them effectively. These tanks required a 5-man crew to operate, and they needed time to familiarize themselves with the equipment and undergo training to achieve a certain level of coordination. More seriously, the new German tanks were equipped with 57mm rapid-fire cannons, and the French army could not find usable ammunition for them, while the captured ammunition was scarce. They had Maxim machine gun ammunition, but no K rounds. After analyzing all the problems, Christine concluded that his only hope lay in the Cambrai line. So, he feigned reassurance about Joffre's impending attack while actively organizing defenses along the line, erecting barbed wire, reinforcing trenches, constructing tank bunkers, and deploying the Saint Salmon M21 tanks as a second line. Everything was proceeding intensively in the darkness. Christine knew the Germans were also preparing for a counter-offensive, likely scheduled for dawn. Gaston seemed to sense danger and nervously asked Christine, can we hold off the Germans? Christine glanced at his watch and replied, one day, Gaston. We just need to hold them off for one day. What? Gaston was puzzled. What good would holding them off for one day do? Christine leaned closer and whispered something in his ear. Gaston turned around, startled, and stared at Christine in shock. Christine smiled and nodded slightly. Gaston, confirming, beamed with joy. I'm so glad to hear that, General. We should have done this sooner. One day was the defensive time Charles had given Christine. The 1st Tank Brigade was en route to Cambrai, a journey that would take them a day, thanks to Guerrieri's coordination. Charles's troops would normally require 2 days to assemble and engage in battle, but now that Christine was under his command, Charles felt it necessary to expedite her rescue. As dawn broke, the Cambrai defenses were shrouded in thick fog, seemingly isolating them from the hustle and bustle of the world and the cruelty of war, leaving only a soft white expanse. But this was all an illusion. Suddenly, the whistling of artillery shells echoed across the sky, several exploding on the Cambrai lines. One shell struck directly into a trench, sending French soldiers and debris flying high into the air. The whistling grew denser, soon becoming indistinguishable, as shells pounded the defenses one after another, kicking up clouds of mud and dust. The impact points repeatedly crisscrossed the Cambrai lines, again and again, like a rake meticulously tilling every inch of land. The continuous shockwaves repeatedly collapsed the trenches, burying piles of French soldiers alive. The trenches were mangled beyond recognition, the soil and body parts mingled, stained a horrifying red with blood. Even the tanks hidden in the bunkers were not spared, they were either directly hit and blown to pieces or buried beneath the surface by the waves of earth. The bombardment lasted for over an hour. When the shelling finally ceased, the Cambrai line was riddled with layers of craters, and the world seemed to have changed completely. Charles's rule of no prolonged artillery preparation before a tank attack clearly did not apply to the Germans. The Germans possessed an absolute advantage in long-range artillery, easily suppressing the French army's 105mm howitzers. Christine practically crawled out of a mound of earth. The trench near the command post had been hit hard by a shell, and the fallen sand had blocked the tunnel entrance. The guards had to use entrenching tools to dig their way out. Spitting out the mud in her mouth, Christine climbed to the edge of the trench and looked through her binoculars. German soldiers were surging towards them like a dark cloud. Leading the way were about 60 of their new tanks. Damn it, Christine cursed. This meant the Germans had been replenished, they probably had more tanks than that. German infantry followed closely behind, bayonets already fixed to their rifles, clearly prepared for hand-to-hand combat. Squadrons of artillery followed the advance, pushing 77mm cannons. This was a common tactic used by the Germans during offensives. They used 105mm howitzers to suppress the French 75mm guns, then used 77mm guns to fire at French fortifications and machine gun positions at close range. If it weren't for Charles's mortars, the French army would have suffered heavy casualties under this offensive tactic. "Prepare," Christine shouted. The signalman relayed the order with flags, and French soldiers emerged one by one from the earthen mounds, setting up rifles and machine guns in front of the trenches, placing grenades with safety pins off within easy reach, and mortar operators finding a flat spot to use as firing platforms. Behind them, the surviving Saint M21s emerged from their bunkers amidst the roar of their engines, aiming their guns and cannons at the advancing enemy. A major battle had begun. Chapter 382 Storm Assault Battalion. The battle escalated rapidly from the outset. German soldiers, under the cover of tank and field artillery fire, launched a frenzied assault on the French lines, while machine gunners advanced in layers, attempting to close the distance for firing. The French, however, fought with a desperate determination. Before the battle, Christine held a short meeting with his men. He asked, "Have you seen the enemy tanks we've captured? Which tank do you think is superior to ours?" His men laughed, answering one after another, "Of course, the German tanks, General. Compared to their tanks, ours are practically toys. I don't think ours can even be called tanks. Schneider is better suited to producing artillery." "I completely agree," Christine replied, then asked, "But that's not what I'm talking about. Have you considered what this means for us?" His men exchanged glances, not understanding Christine's meaning. "Imagine this," Christine waved towards the defensive line. "What would happen if the enemy broke through our lines, and they had these tanks?" His men were silent for a moment, then quickly understood. "We can't retreat, General. The German tanks will follow us." "Yes, just like the troops defeated by the Germans before. They couldn't outrun the tanks, they were either captured or killed. Less than a tenth managed to escape. Although we have tanks, they are easily destroyed. We won't be much better off than those infantry." Christine nodded. "So we have no way out, gentlemen. Hold the line or die, understand?" "Yes, General, understood." Christine cleverly transformed his perceived weakness into the soldiers' courage. Knowing they had no way out, the French soldiers fought with increasing ferocity. Riflemen fell in front of the trenches, and immediately others dragged their bodies down to take their place. Machine gunners fell in the trenches, and soon others rushed to their front, picked up their guns, and continued firing at the enemy. Even Christine joined the battle, his hoarse voice urging his soldiers to keep fighting as he fired his rifle at the enemy. The German tactics remained unchanged. Tanks would break through trenches and lines, then turn back to assist infantry in capturing fortifications. However, Christine's defenses were precisely designed to counter this tactic. He positioned his Saint-Main des M21s on the second line of defense, cleverly designing the tank bunkers in two layers. The first layer was deeper, keeping the tanks below ground level to avoid heavy losses under enemy fire. The second layer was shallower, so that when the tanks advanced up the slope, only the machine guns or 37mm cannons were exposed. This meant the Germans could only see a small portion of the French tanks above their firing range, the larger chassis completely hidden within the bunkers. Thus, even with overwhelming German firepower, and several Upper Silesia tanks successfully breaking through the French lines, they were destroyed one after another by the French. The battle lasted for over an hour, with both sides suffering casualties and the battle remaining deadlocked. However, the replenished German forces still held an advantage in both manpower and firepower, and the tide of victory gradually turned in their favor. Finally, the Germans stormed into the French trenches and engaged in hand-to-hand combat, the situation becoming extremely critical. At that moment, the rumble of engines filled the air. It was French planes, Caproni bombers, a dark mass of at least 50. The infantry, locked in fierce fighting on the ground, paid no heed to the aerial situation, continuing their grueling battle in the trenches with bayonets, shovels, and stones. They habitually assumed that bombers wouldn't target infantry. Their targets would be high-value artillery, convoys, or warehouses. However, they soon realized their mistake. The bombers rapidly descended, their noses swooping down towards the ground, their broad wings almost sweeping over the soldiers' heads as they passed the Cambrai line. Then, volleys of bombs were dropped from beneath the wings and fuselage. Boom, 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 dot. Hundreds of bombs, like a carpet spread across the ground, turned the German forces into a blaze of fire, instantly engulfing all follow-up German units, including tanks, in smoke. Everyone was stunned. The German soldiers hadn't expected bombers to have such deadly power, wiping out entire groups of soldiers in the blink of an eye and completely changing the outcome of the battle. The French soldiers were bewildered. Weren't those Charles's bombers? Why was he going to such lengths to help the 1st Special Artillery Division, which was on the opposing side? Even if he was forced to bomb due to orders, he could have at least made a show of it. But they didn't have time to think further, cheering and launching a counterattack against the Germans. Christine knew what was happening. Covered in blood, he looked gratefully at the bombers flying away in the sky, thinking that Charles had saved him once again. Following Charles was different. He knew when he needed help the most, and he knew how to win this battle. On the other side, Major General Nicholas, commander of the German 1st Tank Division, could no longer maintain his composure. He angrily shouted at his staff officer, "Where are our fighters? Why are we allowed to be bombed by enemy bombers? How can we take their positions if this continues?" The staff officer replied, "General, our fighters are on standby at Hamilton Airfield." Major General Nicholas then remembered that this was his own idea, to keep the Air Force low-key to avoid prematurely revealing the new fighters. Major General Nicholas realized this was another dilemma Charles had presented him. If they continued to keep a low profile and not deploy the new fighters, the French bombers would continue their bombing raids, and the German army would undoubtedly face defeat. But if they deployed the new fighters, they might be caught off guard by Charles's new aircraft. To deploy or not to deploy? Worse still, Charles's reinforcements were said to be on their way. They had to defeat this 1st Special Artillery Division before the reinforcements arrived. After a moment's consideration, Major General Nicholas gritted his teeth and ordered, "Send up the 1st Storm Assault Battalion." "But General," the staff officer replied, "they've only just been formed." Major General Nicholas gave the staff officer a cold glance, and the staff officer quickly swallowed the rest of his words, only replying, "Yes, sir." The image above shows the German Storm Assault units formed in 1915. Their designations were usually Storm Assault Battalions, with one battalion assigned to each corps. Initially equipped with armor for bulletproof protection and close combat, they soon realized mobility was more important and discontinued the armor. Chapter 383: Infiltrating the Enemy Line. During World War I, when the enemy and our forces were locked in a stalemate of trench warfare, the Allied powers' approach was to develop tanks or open new fronts in other directions. The German army, however, considered whether a highly effective infantry force could break through the enemy lines and thus expand its gains for victory. This highly effective infantry was the Storm Assault Battalion. At this time, the Storm Assault Battalion was newly formed, led and trained by its proponent, Major Willy Rohl, who selected over 500 elite German soldiers to form a battalion based on his own tactical ideas. They trained in Berlin for 3 weeks. Upon receiving the combat order, Major Willy paused, handing the telegram to Battalion Commander Major Rick. "What do you think?" Major Rick glanced at the telegram, a hint of worry in his eyes. "We're not ready. Many of them don't even know each other." "That's not important," Willy replied, his gaze firm. "As long as we know how to fight this battle, that's enough. The battlefield is the best training ground." This was Major Willy's true thought. He believed the training ground was merely for exploring unknown theories, while the battlefield was for practice, verification, and results. Only actual combat could refine theories and provide experience for the subsequent Storm Assault team. "There will never be a moment of being ready, Rick," Major Willy said. "If we stay on the training ground forever." Major Rick nodded helplessly, agreeing that Major Willy's idea had some merit. Besides, as battalion commander, he was only responsible for how to fight. Whether to fight and when to participate was up to Chief Instructor Willy. At 3 o'clock the next morning, the fully armed 1st Storm Assault Team arrived in Cambrai by train. Major General Nicholas, commander of the 1st Tank Division, personally went to the train station to greet them. On the way to the front lines, Major General Nicholas eagerly shone a flashlight on a map and said to Major Willy, "The situation is urgent, Major. The 1st Tank Brigade of Charles is already on its way as reinforcements. I'm not sure when they'll arrive. I only know that we must break through the enemy lines as quickly as possible to have more time to prepare for battle." Willy didn't even glance at the map, replying directly, 2 hours later. "What?" Major General Nicholas looked up at Willy, his eyes filled with doubt. "We will attack at dawn, General," Willy replied. "The plan is simple: infiltrate the enemy lines before dawn, and launch a simultaneous attack after daybreak." Nicholas paused, then nodded slightly. So the Storm Assault Team was to infiltrate the enemy lines rather than be an advance force. He was right. Infiltrating the enemy lines would be far more effective than being an advance force. Finally, Willy glanced at the map in Nicholas's hand and concluded, "So, what I need isn't this kind of map. What I need is a map of the enemy's trench layout." As dawn broke, German artillery shells pelted the French lines intermittently, adding a touch of gunpowder to the early morning mist. Major Willy cautiously peered through his binoculars at the opposite side for a moment. Seeing no movement from the French, he raised his hand slightly and gestured forward. The 1st Storm Assault Battalion, already prepared, set off amidst the artillery fire. They wore M1915 Prussian helmets, all with the pointed tops removed. The image above shows the German M1915 helmet. Compared to older helmets, the biggest difference was the removable pointed top, which easily exposed German soldiers in trench warfare, especially in sunlight. Each man wore steel armor on his chest, his waist was tucked with grenades, and some even had several in their backpacks. Clutching carbines and lightweight Maxim rifles, they crept out of the trenches like ghosts and disappeared into the smoke of exploding shells. The image above shows the Kar 98 AZ, a short-barreled rifle better suited for mobile warfare within trenches, standard equipment for the Storm Commandos. The image above shows the MG 815 light machine gun, essentially a lightweight version of the Maxim heavy machine gun, a compromise made before the invention of the submachine gun. The breakthrough point was chosen by Major Willy after repeated observation of the terrain. It wasn't the closest point to the enemy lines, but rather a depression in the defensive perimeter. To the left of the advance route was a small hill that could obscure the view of the French troops to the south, while to the right were several trees, similarly making the area difficult for the French to see. "What we need to do is fire a few shells this way," Major Willy said to Major General Nicholas, pointing to the map. This, and this," but Major Willy emphasized, "not too many, 5 to 10 is best." Major General Nicholas nodded. He understood Major Willy's intention. Too many shells would only arouse suspicion from the French. Originally, Major Willy didn't need to personally lead the charge. He was a researcher of the Storm Commando tactical theory, and he was supposed to survive to summarize the experience and continue training another batch of Storm Commandos. However, Major Willy chose to stay with his troops, treating this battle as an opportunity to put his theory into practice. He carefully led his troops, crouching low, advancing across the battlefield, Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes stopping in shell craters, sometimes crawling, and occasionally using hand gestures to direct a few snipers to provide cover for the troops when they occupied the high ground. The entire process took nearly 20 minutes, including cutting through the barbed wire and passing through the gaps, finally reaching the French trenches before dawn. The French were completely unaware of their actions. Major Willie, lying prone in the trench, could even hear the French sentries discussing inside. "God, it's finally dawn. They said Charles's reinforcements would arrive today. Is it almost time? As soon as Charles's troops arrive, we'll be safe. Charles is a good man. It's hard to imagine him fighting the Germans with us. I mean, he's genuinely sincere. Yes, if the bombers had been a second later yesterday, we might have been finished." Major Willie didn't listen any further. He turned and gestured behind him. The German soldiers understood, one by one drawing grenades from their waists and unscrewing the safety caps. Major Willie waited a moment longer, then resolutely waved his hand forward. One after another, the German soldiers pulled the pins on their grenades and tossed them forward, sending grenades tumbling into the trenches, trailing smoke. First came the panicked cries of the French soldiers, followed by a series of loud explosions. Without Major Willie's orders, squads of German soldiers leaped up, grabbed their rifles, jogged a short distance, and then scrambled into the trenches. The dense gunfire was almost entirely devoid of screams. It was the assault battalion finishing off the stunned enemy. Assault battalions typically didn't use bayonets, not only because the limited space in the trenches made bayonet-equipped rifles unsuitable, but also because Major Willie believed the assault battalion needed to create survivability for themselves as quickly as possible, a trench under their control, a trench large enough to accommodate an entire battalion. Chapter 384 Camel Fighter Jet. The German 1st Storm Assault Battalion launched a fierce attack on the French lines from the trenches. They would first throw a few grenades around a corner, followed by an explosion, then soldiers armed with MG-08/15 light machine guns would emerge and spray fire on the French soldiers who were still dazed or had just crawled out of the trenches. Riflemen would then rush forward to provide precise follow-up shots. If they encountered a trench, their first instinct was to stuff a few grenades inside. Meanwhile, the main German force also launched a frontal assault on the French lines, under the cover of tanks. Caught off guard, the French soldiers were powerless to resist, firing only a few shots before retreating in large numbers, despite Christine's attempts to stop them. Amidst the shouts of the German soldiers, Gaston crouched low in the crowd and found Christine, yelling, "Retreat, General! It'll be too late if we don't leave now," Christine retorted loudly. "We have no way out. No matter how fast we run, we can't outrun enemy tanks. No, we have a way out." Gaston gritted his teeth and replied, "Just leave the 2nd Artillery Regiment behind." "What?" Christine looked at Gaston in shock. The 2nd Artillery Regiment was Gaston's unit. "Yes, General," Gaston said firmly, "we have no other choice, otherwise none of us will make it back alive." "But, you?" Gaston patted Christine's shoulder, interrupting him, "Take care of my family." "You made the right choice." Christine understood what Gaston meant. He was referring to joining the Charles. Before Christine could give the order, Gaston grabbed his pistol and waved it at the communications soldier behind him, shouting, "2nd Artillery Regiment, advance." The communications soldier waved signal flags behind him, and the Saint March M21 tanks, originally on the second line, emerged from their bunkers one by one, driving against the retreating French troops towards the charging Germans. "Get out of here," Gaston shouted at Christine in a commanding tone, with a hint of sarcasm. "Tell Joffre that I've launched the attack according to his orders. Hold out to the last moment." In this battle, the Saint March M21s were almost completely wiped out. Only a few tank crewmen survived, but they were either burned or stunned. The deaths of the others were extremely gruesome. The body of Regiment Commander Gaston was never found, and it was impossible to know which charred or mangled corpse was his. However, they successfully covered the retreat of the main force of the 1st Special Artillery Division. As the German army relentlessly pursued Christine, Char's 1st Tank Brigade arrived just in time, firmly blocking their advance. Having prior knowledge of the precise data and tactics of the new German tanks, and with the Char A1 equipped with additional armor, even the German tanks armed with 57mm guns couldn't penetrate its frontal armor. Therefore, the Germans were predictably defeated by the catching up 1st Tank Brigade. However, the artillery wasn't actually that important. Knowing the Germans relied on K-round ammunition, Char ordered his troops to attach sandbags to the sides of their tanks, positioned at the height of enemy machine guns. The Germans, as before, didn't use tank guns, relying instead on machine guns loaded with K-round ammunition. This was theoretically sound. Tank guns at this time had very low accuracy, and even at close range, the high-density fire of machine guns was far more reliable. However, only at the moment of close proximity did the German machine gunners realize with horror that they weren't facing enemy side armor, but rather sandbags. Bullets fired one after another, causing only holes in the sandbags from which sand spilled out. Meanwhile, the Char A1 tank's gun had rotated at an angle, waiting patiently until the tanks were positioned so that their side armor was perpendicular to the Char A1's 37mm guns, at which point it fired with a deafening roar. German tanks fell one after another, crippled on the battlefield, belching smoke in a blaze. This tank, developed specifically to counter the Char A1, unexpectedly found itself being countered by the Char A1 on the battlefield. After suffering a crushing defeat on the ground, the German army finally couldn't resist deploying new fighter jets, hoping to reverse the disadvantage for their ground forces by seizing air superiority. Major General Nicholas planned to use them to block the devastating carpet bombing by the bombers. Although the Fokker E-1 fighter had a top speed of 133 km per hour, this was still slower than the Caproni bomber's 137 km per hour. However, the difference was negligible, and the Fokker E-1's small and agile fuselage made it capable of shooting down the Caproni in actual combat. Against the French Avro fighter, with a speed of only 100 km per hour, it was even less of a problem. Once the Germans gained complete air superiority, they could use their air power and 105mm howitzers to suppress Charles's tank forces. Unfortunately, as Nicholas had predicted, the French did indeed develop a new fighter jet, a much faster and more maneuverable aircraft than the Fokker E-1, the Camel. The image above shows the Camel, a 150 horsepower engine with a top speed of 187 km per hour. It pioneered the use of a smooth, curved fairing on the nose, and the two machine guns also used fairings resembling a camel's humps, hence the name Camel. It was the first fighter jet to utilize aerodynamic design to increase speed. The air battle was one-sided. German planes were shot down one after another like turkeys with their tails burned. Even when the Germans still had planes, they dared not take to the skies. Colonel Immelmann, in charge of commanding the air battle, stared blankly at the telegram from the front lines, which displayed a cold and cruel number. 43-1, 43 lost, only one enemy shot down. Moreover, that plane was probably shot down by the Germans because its engine malfunctioned and it couldn't accelerate. This isn't air combat, this is slaughter. Colonel Immelmann gritted his teeth and order all units to withdraw to the airfield. Colonel, the staff officer replied, but Major General Nicholas wants us to send all our aircraft up. He says it's crucial, otherwise the infantry will suffer devastating attacks from enemy bombers. Colonel Immelmann was silent for a moment, then finally shook his head and said, no, tell Major General Nicholas that we can't stop anything. Doing so will only increase aircraft losses and pilot casualties, meaningless casualties. The most important factor was the pilots. Immelmann understood this. The German skilled pilots had already suffered heavy casualties under continuous French bombing raids. If they were sent up to their deaths, even if Germany developed faster fighters capable of competing with the enemy, Germany would still be at a disadvantage due to lack of pilots. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 385 Britain's Trembling. Hello everyone, happy Mid-Autumn Festival. I haven't been able to write more than 3 chapters in the past few days because I've been visiting relatives and friends. I apologize, but I will adjust to my writing mode as soon as possible. Thank you all. Charles' 1st Tank Brigade not only routed the attacking German forces but also pushed the defensive line forward by 8 kilometers, killing and wounding more than 10,000 German soldiers and capturing more than 8,000, while losing only 18 tanks and suffering more than 500 casualties. It was undoubtedly a remarkable victory. Note, casualties of the French 1st Special Artillery Division are not included in the statistics. The French people and military were once again stunned by this victory. They spontaneously took to the streets, cheering and shouting, "Long live France, long live the 1st Tank Brigade." Some even asked, "Why don't we march on Berlin?" Many others agreed, and major newspapers echoed this sentiment. If our army has such a significant advantage, Charles' troops alone could rout the Germans, and ending the war might not be impossible. I think so too. I believe we have the capability, but Charles' troops should be the first priority. The only thing we need to consider seems to be whether the army is using the Char model, whether the officers are using Char's tactics. Char didn't care about these things. He knew it was too early to say marching on Berlin or ending the war. Historically, the Renault tank, the Char A1 he used, was mass-produced in 1917, but even with its deployment, it didn't immediately entrench warfare. This was because the war had gradually shifted to systematic warfare, which meant that a single branch of the armed forces or the development of a particular piece of equipment could not fundamentally change the battlefield situation. For example, the German army consistently held an advantage in long-range howitzers, while the French army's production rate was only 5 per month, a quantity that couldn't even keep up with battle losses. On the other hand, artillery technology was basically monopolized by Schneider, and there were certain technological barriers, making it difficult to expand production and increase output in a short period. This determined that the German army had the potential to prevent tanks from breaking through the front lines, which was one of the reasons why the 1st Tank Brigade was stalled after penetrating 8 kilometers. Charles was interested in the German storm assault teams, and he flipped through one photo after another sent from the front. They were taken by the 1st Tank Brigade, showing that they had captured more than 100 storm assault teams during their advance. These storm assault teams were very conspicuous because they were wearing steel armor and could hardly move without vehicle mobility. Tigony's actions were perplexing. He leaned closer to look at the photos on the table and said, "Everyone's thinking about whether we're going to take Berlin, and you're looking at these. What's so special about them?" Wearing steel armor, Tigony considered the Storm Commando foolish. He couldn't believe people were still going to the battlefield in medieval armor. "What good would that do?" "They're not as simple as you think, General," Charles said. "The steel armor can certainly be eliminated, but the tactics are quite advanced." This was the concept of modern special forces, similar to tanks. Capable of infiltrating and precisely striking key enemy targets, with better concealment and flexibility. Tigony raised an eyebrow, dismissing Charles's words. He believed nothing in this era could compare to tanks, everything else was utterly insignificant before them. At that moment, General Winter entered the office, looking at Charles with a complex expression. "I need to speak with you alone, Brigadier General." Charles nodded and rose to lead General Winter into the adjacent conference room. "What?" Charles gestured for General Winter to sit down and asked, "Isn't this victory remarkable enough?" "No." General Winter shook his head. "You did very well, Brigadier General. We believe the Italians will join the Allies because of this battle. They've even contacted us." Then, Charles looked at General Winter with a puzzled expression. "Your fighter plane." General Winter's gaze was slightly hesitant. "A new fighter plane. I'd like to know if it's available for sale." Charles suddenly understood. Britain was wary of the fighter plane he was developing. Charles's guess was correct. When news of the victory reached London, the First Lord of the Admiralty was not happy about it. Instead, his brow was furrowed and his face was full of worry. The First Lord of the Admiralty held a photograph in his hand, showing a Camel fighter plane flying in the air, fighting against German aircraft. He stared blankly for a moment, then asked in a low voice, "Are you sure it can reach 180 kilometers per hour?" "Yes," Major Kyle replied confidently. "We deployed personnel to monitor the speed of the Germans' new fighter jets, but we inadvertently detected the Charles fighter. Everyone was shocked by its speed. We verified it several times, it might even exceed 180 kilometers per hour." The Navy Minister nodded gravely and asked slowly, "What is the top speed of our most advanced fighter jets?" 140 kilometers per hour, Major Kyle said somewhat helplessly. "It's still undergoing test flights and hasn't entered service yet." That was the Havilland DH-2 fighter jet, modified from the DH-1 two-seat version. One cockpit was removed to reduce weight, and a 100 horsepower engine was installed, giving it a top speed of 140 kilometers per hour. The image above shows the British Havilland DH-2 fighter plane, which successfully completed its maiden flight in 1915. The First Lord of the Admiralty snorted in dissatisfaction. "Do you know what this means? We may be far behind the French, or more precisely, far behind the Charles. As the world's leading power, he could not accept the reality of falling behind another country, even if that other country was an ally. Especially an ally. With allies leading the way, Britain could only watch helplessly as they continued to develop. Aircraft are everything, Kyle, the First Lord of the Admiralty said thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on the photograph. One day, if France becomes our enemy, their fighters will shoot down our planes just as they shot down the Germans. I understand, Your Excellency, Kyle suggested. Perhaps we could try to cooperate with the Charles, or buy this fighter plane. The First Lord of the Admiralty looked somewhat embarrassed. The world's leading power was now trying to cooperate with the Charles. But what could they do now? The result of not cooperating was watching them surpass Britain, falling further and further behind. Thus, purchasing fighter jets instantly became the highest priority, even surpassing efforts to bring Italy into the Entente. The latter was a matter for the entire Entente, while the former concerned British security. After all, the English Channel is only 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and if France on the other side possessed such advanced fighter jets, it would send chills down Britain's spine. France could seize British airspace at any time. What kind of world's leading power would Britain then be? Chapter 386. Is it outdated equipment? General Winter looked at Charles with anticipation, a hint of fear in his eyes. He couldn't imagine what Britain would do if Charles answered no. Force Charles to hand over the technology? Not only did Britain lack that power, but the French government and citizens weren't fools either. On this issue, they would all side with Charles, even Joffre and Schneider. Then, Britain would have no choice but to admit its backwardness. This was no small matter for Britain, the world's leading power. Its prestige would collapse instantly, and it might even lose control of its colonies. Fortunately, this didn't happen. Charles nodded slightly. It can be sold, as long as there's a suitable price. General Winter secretly breathed a sigh of relief, then eagerly asked, "Of course, Brigadier General. A suitable price, we won't let you down." While saying this, he was inwardly somewhat disappointed in Charles. Did he know this could neutralize Britain's trump card? Or had he simply regarded Britain as an ally without any suspicion? Or did he not understand how to utilize this advantage? Charles considered for a moment and said, "As you know, General, we lack large caliber howitzers." General Winter instantly understood and nodded in reply, "No problem, we can exchange them for 6-inch $30 howitzers." Charles stared coldly at General Winter without saying a word. General Winter understood and immediately changed his tune, "Not just artillery, but the entire production line, Brigadier General." "A whole production line, plus a whole team of skilled workers," Charles interrupted General Winter. "Although we are friends, General, that doesn't mean I'll make significant concessions in business. You should know the performance of the Camel fighter jet. It's the most advanced fighter jet in the world, and you intend to exchange it for an outdated artillery piece." Charles sat up straight, expressionless, and said, "You can go back now, General. We're wasting our time." No. General Winter quickly stopped Charles. "We have artillery, the latest type of artillery, which we haven't even had time to equip ourselves with yet. It was developed to counter the German 105mm howitzer." Charles grunted and sat back down in his chair. General Winter's tone carried a hint of helplessness. "It's a 6-inch 26-calorie howitzer. We currently only have 3 production lines, producing about 18 per month." The image above shows a British 6-inch 26-calorie howitzer. 6 inches refers to the 152mm caliber, and 26 calories refers to the weight of the barrel and breech, approximately 1,300 kilograms. This gun was one of the main artillery pieces of the British Army in World War I, developed in 1915 and entering service at the end of the year. Charles knew this gun. While its range was shorter than the German 105mm howitzer, firing lightweight ammunition, 39 kg, with a range of only 10.4 kilometers, its large caliber and ample propellant made it far more powerful than the German 105mm howitzer. Besides suppressing 105mm howitzers, it could easily destroy barbed wire and bunkers. Firing heavier ammunition, 45 kg, made it an even greater bunker killer. Furthermore, it could fire fuel shells and smoke shells, making it a true battlefield all-rounder. "I need 5 production lines," Charles said firmly. "Complete them within 2 months. This is impossible, Brigadier General." General Winter stared at Charles in shock. "This means the British Army will be without artillery for a considerable period of time." This wasn't a sale, it was a complete handover. It required Britain to dedicate its entire national resources to building them for Charles, and even to dismantle its own production lines and send them to France. Charles rose again as if to leave, and General Winter panicked, quickly stopping him. "Let me think about it." "Everything is negotiable," Charles replied decisively, "either airplanes or artillery. Camel planes aren't something you can just trade for anything. If you could, you wouldn't be sitting here talking to me, would you?" Charles then added, "I'm sorry, General, I must keep my personal and professional matters separate." "Of course." General Winter nodded in understanding. He considered for a moment and said, "I must at least consult London." Charles nodded. "You should." General Winter shook hands with Charles and left, his brow furrowed in deep thought, seemingly considering how to report to his superiors. Charles returned to the command post, where Tidjany was sitting in his chair signing documents. He casually asked, "Is there a problem?" "No," Charles replied calmly, "he's just here to discuss business." Tidjany nodded with an O. A deal that could make General Winter so nervous must be related to military equipment. What could it be? He was curious. Suddenly, Tidjany stopped what she was doing, looked up at Charles with a grave expression. "He's not here to buy new fighter jets, is he?" It wasn't hard to guess. Britain was an island nation. The only things that could make her nervous were warships and fighter jets, because only they posed a threat to Britain. Warships were out of the question. Britain was always number one, and Charles couldn't change that. That left only fighter jets, Charles's new fighter jets. Charles didn't speak, which was taken as tacit agreement. "You're not planning to sell them to them, are you?" Tidjany asked again, her face turning extremely grim. "Why not?" Charles countered, "as long as the price is right." Tidjany jumped to her feet, her eyes filled with shock and anger. "Are you crazy? That's the Camel, the most advanced fighter jet. With it, we could even crush the entire UK, and you're planning to sell it to her?" Tidjany wasn't exaggerating, especially in an era with virtually no air defense equipment. France could easily use Camel fighters to seize air superiority over Britain, and then use Caproni bombers to bomb the British Isles, bombing wherever they wanted, as long as the range allowed. Then, what face would Britain have to call itself the world's leading power? Charles half-jokingly asked, "You plan to go to war with Britain?" "No, that's not what I meant." Tidjany panicked, gesturing wildly as he explained, "I mean, we have the capability to put pressure on Britain, and we can use that to gain a voice. That's politics, that's diplomacy." Charles smiled and nodded at Tidjany. Another advantage of Tidjany was his understanding of international geopolitics, perhaps related to his background. Perhaps one day, he could be put in charge of international affairs. Tidjany read something from Charles's expression. "You know this, don't you?" "Yes." Charles didn't deny it. "Then why are you still?" "It's simple," Charles replied calmly. "Firstly, because I need to use Britain to defeat our domestic rivals. Secondly, we're selling outdated equipment, General. So there's no need to worry too much." Tidjany stared wide-eyed at Charles. "Outdated equipment? You mean camels, which are outdated equipment?" Chapter 387 The Bombing of London. Camel was indeed outdated equipment for Charles, whose aircraft engines had reached 180 horsepower, while the Camel's engine only had 150 horsepower. In this respect, the Germans were ahead, with their engines also reaching 180 horsepower, and had achieved this level long before Charles. The difference was that the Germans installed the most advanced engines on Zeppelin airships to increase speed and put them back into service. Note, the Germans stubbornly believed that airships could bring them victory, despite the existence of rockets and machine gun incendiary bombs that could destroy them. The German airships persisted until 1918. The last airship destroyed had a 200 horsepower engine. Night fell in London, England, the dim lights shimmering on the Thames, a cool evening breeze gently brushing the treetops, carrying a barely perceptible dampness in the air. The First Lord of the Admiralty, still in his pajamas, entered his study. Without even turning on the light, he hastily poured himself a glass of whiskey and downed it in one gulp. He then poured another, grabbed it, and expertly lit a cigar before finally turning on the light and sitting in the rocking chair by the window, gazing absently at the night view. The cigar burned slowly between his fingers, the swirling smoke seemingly embodying his anxiety, gathering in the air until it filled the entire study. The First Lord of the Admiralty was deliberating over the deal for the Camel fighter plane. It wasn't that the deal was unprofitable. Exchanging 5 artillery production lines for the security of British airspace was imperative. However, the First Lord of the Admiralty's character was one of wanting more, and wanting more. He was thinking that the British Army would be unable to equip itself with new artillery for the next 6 months, or even longer. The key point was, the development of this 6-inch 26-calorie howitzer wasn't just aimed at the German 105mm howitzer, but also at the French army. The French army also had 105mm howitzers, various types of tanks, and Charles's infantry regiments, all of which would be annihilated by the new artillery. To sell the artillery production line to France now meant that the British army would have no advantage and no secrets. Therefore, when the First Lord of the Admiralty received General Winter's telegram, he was instantly furious. This is outrageous. It's just an aircraft, yet he demands 5 artillery production lines. Does he know what 5 artillery production lines mean? We could win this war with them. Besides, we are allies. Shouldn't allies share technology? After some consideration, the First Lord of the Admiralty did not reply to Charles but instead sent a telegram to Clemenceau, a member of the French Army Council, in which he denounced Charles's various offenses. 5 production lines. This is not a deal. This is to completely destroy Britain's new artillery, which is clearly detrimental to the war effort. It's not that we lack aircraft technology. We simply hope to exchange resources so that both sides can develop their aircraft better and faster to defeat the enemy. This would benefit both of us, but Charles is standing in the middle, becoming an uncertain factor. The First Lord of the Admiralty hoped to pressure Charles through the government to cancel or reduce the price. However, Clemenceau was no fool. He replied bluntly, "I'm very sorry, Your Excellency. This is Charles's private property. He owns full industrial property rights, and we have no right to interfere. At the same time, we don't think there's anything wrong with Charles's actions. His request for your country's production lines is also for the sake of technological exchange, which is also beneficial to both of us." The First Lord of the Admiralty was speechless. His greedy behavior, always focusing on others' obligations while neglecting his own, only became apparent when he was used against himself. The First Lord of the Admiralty gently rocked his chair, lost in thought amidst its creaking. Should he really exchange 5 artillery production lines for it? Or should he urgently modify those 5 artillery production lines and temporarily develop an export version? But that seemed inappropriate. Charles wasn't a fool. If the artillery was an export version, the aircraft he provided would also be an export version. The result would still be that Britain suffered, because air superiority would remain in French hands. Just as the First Lord of the Navy hesitated, a muffled boom came from afar, followed by a burst of light in the darkness, which soon turned into a wisp of smoke. The First Lord of the Navy sat bolt upright in shock, initially thinking it was an accident, perhaps an explosion at a flour mill or munitions factory. But he quickly realized this was not the case. The explosions came in rapid succession, one after another, from the same direction. "What's going on?" The First Lord of the Navy rose and opened the window, his gaze sweeping over the buildings towards the source of the fire. It looked like enemy artillery fire, but London was far from the front lines. Artillery couldn't possibly be hitting this area. Just as the First Lord of the Navy was wondering, a piercing and prolonged air raid siren sounded. One by one, lights came on in the previously dark residential area, and people leaned out of their windows to look at the sky, trying to understand what was happening. Some even climbed onto rooftops. However, nothing could be seen in the darkness, only the explosions echoed through London. Searchlights were switched on, beams of light pointing like swords into the sky, but still nothing was found. Note, in 1915, the British did not believe that Germans had any equipment capable of bombing London, so they were completely unprepared for air defense. Searchlights were mostly used by infantry, with a range of about 1,000 meters, while airships were at altitudes of over 3,000 meters. Churchill ran back to his desk, frantically rummaging through a drawer for a telescope, then rushed back to the window to look up at the sky, his fingers trembling with nervousness. Just then, the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating a colossal object nestled among them. The First Lord of the Admiralty looked at this thing and felt a chill run down his spine. It was like the strange creature described in Wells or Jules Verne's science fiction novels. Its silver hull was vaguely visible in the moonlight, and it seemed to be throwing things down. Then, a series of explosions came from below. "Your Excellency," the study door was pushed open, and the belated guards nervously protected the First Lord of the Admiralty. "What was that?" the First Lord of the Admiralty asked, his voice filled with fear. "It's an airship, Your Excellency," the guard replied. "A German Zeppelin." The First Lord of the Admiralty grunted and glared at the guard. "How did they get here? Don't we have planes and rockets? Why didn't we destroy them en route?" instead letting them fly over London and drop bombs on our heads. The guards remained silent. These were not the questions they were asked. The angry First Lord of the Admiralty had clearly asked the wrong person. Chapter 388 Camel is the best choice. Like everyone else, the First Lord of the Admiralty spent a night in terror in the darkness. Only then did the British realize they had nothing to deal with the Zeppelins, airships shrouded in night. 2 planes managed to take off in an attempt to attack, but the Zeppelins were hidden in the dark clouds, making any effective attack impossible. Several rockets fired missed their target. During World War I, many aircraft couldn't reach the altitude of airships. Newer planes could, but low visibility at night and high speeds meant that even knowing the Zeppelin's location made a collision difficult. All they could do was watch as the airship dropped bomb after bomb, blasting the area below into ruins before speeding away. The image above shows a London street after the Zeppelin bombing in 1915. While casualties were low, it caused widespread panic. The next morning, as dawn broke, people, still shaken, slowly emerged from their homes, discussing the ruins left by the previous night's bombing. God, our army was helpless against it. Yes, they couldn't do anything. If that's the case, does it mean that if the Germans have enough airships, they can bomb us all flat? What could be worse than this? During wartime, people tend to amplify their fears, believing they are about to lose the war. This panic can even spread like a plague, even though the previous night's bombing only resulted in 35 deaths and 121 injuries. The First Lord of the Admiralty was lashing out at Major Kyle in his office. You know absolutely nothing about airships. You didn't even know what they were when the enemy was dropping bombs on us. Today it's just 1 airship, tomorrow it could be 2, 3, or even more. At this rate, should we just surrender to the Germans? Kyle, of course, knew the First Lord of the Admiralty was just venting his anger. He stepped forward nervously, pointing to the map, and said, Your Excellency, this situation is mainly because the Germans chose to attack at night. Those are airships. The First Lord of the Admiralty interrupted Kyle. They're as slow as snails. I want to know, how did they cross the English Channel and get to London? Kyle explained, they can reach speeds of 80 kilometers per hour, Your Excellency. They're not snails. Our planes only reach 100 kilometers per hour. The First Lord of the Admiralty was stunned. He had never known airships could reach such speeds. Kyle continued his analysis. We can't stop them from reaching London. We don't know when they'll attack, or their flight path. Unless we send hundreds of planes to patrol the English Channel in shifts. So, we can only wait to be bombed. The First Lord of the Admiral's face contorted with anger. We can catch up with them, Kyle said helplessly, but our fighters aren't fast enough. Even the new Havilland DH-2 fighters can't catch up after dawn. The First Lord of the Admiral turned to Kyle, his voice low. You mean, if our planes are fast enough, we might be able to catch these guys and shoot them down? Yes, Kyle nodded. That's easier than stopping them from entering London, because we know the direction they're heading and their speed. The only problem is we don't have planes that fast. The First Lord of the Admiral immediately thought of Charles's plane, which could reach speeds of 180 kilometers per hour. After a moment's hesitation, the First Lord of the Admiral gritted his teeth and ordered, send a telegram to General Winter. Paris 105th Regiment Command. Charles received intelligence early in the morning that London had been bombed by Zeppelins. The intelligence had arrived the previous night, and the staff, considering it significant but not urgent, hadn't woken Charles, as it was a British matter. Tidjany had gotten up earlier than Charles and seen the news a few minutes earlier. Seeing Charles enter, Tidjany held up the telegram, looking incredulous. The Germans are still using these? I thought they disappeared from the battlefield after you started using rockets. What? Charles took the telegram and understood Tidjany's meaning. The Germans have chosen night combat, General, Charles said, and it's London. At this time, aircraft were almost entirely incapable of night combat, and the British defenses, like those of France, were on the Western Front, with little to no defense on their homeland. You're right, Brigadier General. Tidjany sat back in his chair thoughtfully. I was being presumptuous. It can still be useful, albeit only as a remnant. Tidjany continued, the Germans are clever. They used submarine warfare to blockade Britain, then bombed the homeland with airships. This could worsen Britain's already dire shortages. Charles smiled but remained silent. The German strategy was correct. A pincer attack from within and without would deplete Britain's resources, ultimately forcing its surrender. Coincidentally, they had done the same in World War II. However, it was tactically impractical. Airships were expensive, slow, And while they could inflict limited damage on the enemy, they were easily destroyed, making them practically cost-effective. At that moment, General Winter appeared at the command post entrance. He no longer cared about avoiding other unrelated personnel and went directly to Charles, asking, "I want to know the camel's flight data, Brigadier General. I hope this won't cause you any trouble." "Of course," Charles replied, "top speed 187 kilometers per hour. If needed, you can send pilots to test fly it." General Winter instantly breathed a sigh of relief. He believed it was true. It was roughly the same speed measured by Mi-6. "Is there a problem?" Charles looked at General Winter with suspicion. No problem," General Winter replied. "I just want to know if it can catch up with the German airships." Charles suddenly understood. The British planned to use the Camel to stop the German bombing of London, or rather, to shoot the airships down on their return journey. This wasn't a good idea, Charles thought. The best method would be anti-aircraft guns capable of firing incendiary bombs. But Charles said nothing. He replied solemnly, "No need to consider it, General. Camel is the best choice. It will be a nightmare for airships." "I hope so." General Winter took out a notebook from his pocket, opened it, tore out a page, and handed it to Charles. "We need 30 aircraft to form a squadron, along with ground crew and technicians, as well as spare engines and spare parts." Charles hesitated for a moment before replying, "That's because of you, General. Otherwise, I wouldn't have given so many." General Winter nodded gratefully. "I know, Brigadier General, thank you. Thank you very much." Chapter 389 Another Battlefield. The negotiations went smoothly. Charles traded 30 Camel fighter planes for 5 artillery production lines, 3 of which were dismantled and transported from Britain. Of course, Charles wouldn't hand over all 30 Camels at once. He stipulated in the contract that the 30 Camels would be in training mode until the 3 production lines arrived in Paris and successfully entered production, meaning British pilots would be trained on how to fly them and ground crew on how to maintain them. After all, the person he was dealing with was the First Lord of the Admiralty, whose greed was globally renowned. He was also responsible for the starvation of nearly 10 million Indians after World War II. Dealing with such a shameless and ruthless man required Charles to be extra cautious. That afternoon, after signing the contract, Charles returned to the town of Darvez. He didn't go home, he went directly to the tractor factory to see Joka. Perhaps out of habit, Joka treated the tractor factory as his headquarters, although the aircraft manufacturing plant and newspaper office were also in Paris. Joka didn't interfere much with Steed's arsenal. He believed that as long as Charles maintained his dominance in the army, Steed wouldn't change his mind. However, the affairs of these factories were already keeping Joka busy enough. Recently, he was also venturing into the insurance industry by acquiring bankrupt or struggling insurance companies, leaving him no time even for a cup of coffee. He was so busy that he hadn't been home for several nights, even though his residence was nearby. Camille couldn't help but complain, "I heard our assets are already over 100 million. Don't you think we should be satisfied? What do we need so much money for? Aren't we just eating the same food and living in the same houses? This will never end. I don't understand the point." Joka sat at the table, sipping onion soup and flipping through the newspaper. Entering the insurance industry required him to keep abreast of what was happening in society, even something as small as a fire. As for Camille's words, he paid them no heed. Camille noticed this, and angrily snatched the newspaper from Joka's hands, raising her voice, "Did you hear what I said? You both need to stop and rest, you and Charles, both of you." Joka stared blankly at Camille, taking a while to regain her composure and recall part of Camille's earlier complaint. "Rest? Have we made enough money?" Joka shook her head, her face serious. "No, Camille, we'll never have enough, and now isn't the time to rest. You don't understand, we're on another battlefield." "Another battlefield?" Camille looked puzzled. "Yes," Joka explained, "many capitalists are targeting Charles openly and covertly, even trying to harm him. We've only just started to see some progress. Charles has finally managed to intimidate those capitalists. We must seize this opportunity to grow stronger. And you want us to rest," Joka concluded. "We're not doing this for money, Camille. You could say for money, but more importantly, it's about fighting the capitalists. Do you understand? It's not much better than the real battlefield Charles faces. It's even more dangerous." Camille nodded, seemingly understanding. She sensed the danger and knew Joka wasn't exaggerating. After a moment's hesitation, Camille silently handed the newspaper back to Joka and started clearing the dishes. The competition among capitalists was indeed another battlefield, equally cruel and bloody, only without the visible smoke of battle. Joka, from a merchant family, understood this well, and therefore devoted himself wholeheartedly to the factory's operation. Sometimes, even Joka himself felt that fate was playing tricks on him. He had chosen to stay away from the cutthroat world of business precisely because he couldn't stand it, yet now he had unknowingly been pulled in and was deeply entangled in it. Was it because of Charles? Perhaps at first. But now, Joka felt he was enjoying it. It was a manifestation of self-worth. Watching those once arrogant capitalists being surpassed and defeated by him gave Joka a strange sense of pride and satisfaction. That day, while Joka was busy directing the acquisition of the 9 insurance company over the phone, he was surprised to see Charles, in military uniform, walk into his office and wave at him. Joka quickly gave some instructions on the phone and greeted him with a smile. "What, finally have time to come and see your factory?" As he spoke, Joka glanced at Charles's rank, 2 stars. This was the first time he had seen Charles wearing the rank of brigadier general, and a hint of pride, along with a touch of envy, unconsciously appeared in his eyes. The heights Charles had reached were something he could never touch in his entire life. The image above shows a 2-star brigadier general. The French military originally had a 1-star rank, specifically for brigadier generals, while 2-star brigadier generals were usually division commanders, also known as camp marshals. Later, with 2-star brigadier generals becoming brigadier generals, the 1-star rank was abolished, and the rank jumped directly from the gold stripe of the colonel rank to the 2 stars of brigadier general. Next to Joka's desk was an empty seat, Charles's desk, still bearing the lamp Charles had chosen when he first moved in. If it weren't for the several books Charles often read piled on it, he would hardly recognize his seat. Charles took the coffee his assistant handed him, sat down, and casually asked Joka, "How is the acquisition of the insurance companies going?" "Very smoothly," Joka replied. "We've acquired 3 insurance companies at low prices, all Dunkirk-based. They were terrified by the German bombings and couldn't wait to sell." As he spoke, Joka took a form from his desk and leaned over to hand it to Charles. Charles took the form and glanced at it. The 3 insurance companies combined only cost a little over 10 million francs, indeed a bargain. However, Charles's interest wasn't in that. He tossed the form onto the table, took a sip of his coffee, and asked, "Have you heard about the German bombing of London, father?" "Of course," Joka nodded. "It happened last night. News has spread throughout France." Charles grunted and continued drinking his coffee. Joka suddenly understood. He turned to Charles. "You wouldn't be thinking of developing an insurance business in London, would you?" "Why not?" Charles countered. "Now is the best time to buy at rock-bottom prices." Joka thought about it and agreed. Airships were bombing London, and the British were helpless against it. Everyone thought the Germans would soon escalate the bombing. This caused panic in London. There were even rumors that the Germans had hundreds of airships that would bomb London simultaneously. At this time, opening an insurance company in London would be like a dream come true. People would pour money into it. Chapter 390 Long-Range Cannon. Insurance sells fear and anxiety about the future. People transfer their fear and anxiety to insurance companies, and if these anxieties materialize, the insurance companies compensate them with substantial sums. Of course, policyholders have to pay for this service. Therefore, the more fearful and anxious people are, the better the business for insurance companies. But Joka had a well-thought-out plan. "Good business doesn't mean you can make money, Charles," Joka said, holding a pencil in his hand, a hint of worry in his eyes. "If, as people say, the Germans concentrate a large number of airships to bomb Britain, the consequences are obvious. Insurance companies would likely be wiped out, and Charles would be back to square one." However, Charles knew this wouldn't happen. "I know how to deal with it," Charles said casually. "I just haven't invented the equipment yet." Joka instantly understood. Charles was using his military talent to manipulate the market. It was a good idea. On the one hand, he was using the insurance industry to plunder the wealth of British civilians, and on the other hand, he was inventing equipment to sell to the British government. When the British government bought the equipment to defeat the Germans, it was also serving Charles's insurance company. A perfect closed loop. The profits wouldn't just be 10 or 20 million, they'd easily reach hundreds of millions. Thinking of this, Joka's eyes lit up with excitement, and he nodded. "No problem, I'll send someone to London immediately." With the company having grown to its current size, Joka no longer needed to handle everything personally. After hanging up the phone, Joka smiled at Charles. You know, the most difficult place for us to develop insurance business is precisely Paris. Paris? Charles's gaze turned wary. Is someone interfering? Charles's first thought was of capitalists who were opposing him, especially Schneider. No, Joka shook his head. They seem afraid to compete with us in the insurance industry. Charles, with his military talent, had a unique advantage in this area. He held the power to influence insurance outcomes based on the outcome of war, and no one dared to easily follow suit. Then what is it? Charles asked, somewhat puzzled. Because of you. Joka raised an eyebrow. Me? Charles looked bewildered. Yes, Joka nodded with a smile. Everyone believes that as long as Charles is there, the Germans cannot threaten the safety of Paris, so they are very at ease. In fact, what they are thinking about is when the French army will be able to reach Berlin. Charles said oh, indicating he understood. Without anxiety, the market is inactive. Insurance companies can survive mediocrely and are naturally unwilling to sell at low prices. The solution is to make insurance companies feel threatened, to make them believe that they might lose money in the near future. Only then will they choose to sell. However, turning Paris into a dangerous place is not easy. The Germans reoccupying Paris is decades away. After thinking for a while, Charles had an idea. Prepare the funds, father, Charles said. Things might change in the next few days. Changes? Joka looked at Charles in surprise. You mean, the Germans might attack Paris? Before Charles could answer, Joka exclaimed, my God, airships? They will bomb Paris with airships. Charles shook his head. He did not tell Joka the answer. Some things were not suitable for him to say. Because people would say, that's just a rumor deliberately spread by the insurance company to swindle our money. Therefore, Charles needed an authoritative body to release the news, thereby shaking the seemingly stable Parisian insurance industry. Leave this to me, Charles instructed the Joka before leaving. Also, we need to buy a plot of land nearby to build a factory, probably around 7,000 square meters. 7,000 square meters. The Joka was shocked by this number. That was a large factory. Charles grunted and replied casually, I've purchased 5 artillery production lines from England, and they'll be arriving in a few days. At first, the Joka didn't think much of it. France needed artillery, so purchasing artillery production lines was perfectly normal. But after Charles left, he suddenly realized, my God, artillery production lines, producing artillery. He got up and rushed to the window to call Charles back, but Charles's car had already driven onto the road and was disappearing into the distance. Joka felt somewhat helpless. Producing artillery meant direct competition with Schneider, which would further intensify the conflict between the two, as their existence could threaten each other's survival. The military often abandoned one type of artillery after choosing another. However, watching the car disappear down the road, Joka thought to himself, this day was bound to come sooner or later. He had to face it eventually. Back in Paris, Charles visited the city's garrison headquarters. How have you been lately, General? Charles saluted Gallieri. Gallieri glanced at Charles, feigning indifference. Of course, I'm fine. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand secretly made a face, while the other staff officers smiled without saying a word. The truth was, when Charles wasn't around, Gallieri always seemed to be missing something. He was often inexplicably restless and uneasy, even disrupting his decades-old sleep schedule. He often couldn't sleep at night and got up to work, only to fall asleep at his desk during the day. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand suggested to Gallieni, why don't we bring Charles back? It's not far from the police training base, he can manage both when there's no fighting. No, Gallieni firmly shook his head, he ultimately has to rely on himself, Lieutenant Colonel. This is his opportunity to hone his skills. Gallieni knew very well that Charles leading a unit independently and commanding troops at the city defense headquarters were two different things, though formally they weren't that different. Charles handed Gallieni a book. I heard you haven't been sleeping well lately. Perhaps you can use this to pass the time instead of getting up to work. It was Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Charles hoped Gallieni could enter another world and relax from the state of war. Gallieni was taken aback, then rolled his eyes. That's something for children, Brigadier General. It only proves you haven't grown up yet. Though he said this, a smile played on his lips. I suppose so, Charles replied, placing the book on Gallieri's desk, and then got back to the point. I've received a message, General, that the Germans are planning to build a cannon, an ultra-long-range cannon, and they intend to use it to bombard Paris directly. Everyone was stunned. and they all turned their shocked gazes to Charles, including Gallery. Chapter 391 The Cannons of Paris. Gallery asked with some skepticism, "Are you sure? Cannons that can reach Paris?" "No, I'm not sure," Charles shook his head. "I just received the information, and as for the source, I'm sorry, I have to keep it a secret." Gallery nodded in understanding. Revealing the source would threaten intelligence personnel. It would be tantamount to telling the Germans who the spies were. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand joined the discussion. "I don't think it's credible, Brigadier General. Why don't they just use airships like they did with London?" After last night's events, many were speculating that the Germans would bomb Paris in the same way. "Bombing Paris with airships is not feasible," Charles answered firmly. "Why?" Lieutenant Colonel Fernand asked, puzzled. Charles walked to the large map hanging on the wall, gesturing as he explained. "From both a strategic and tactical perspective, it's highly unlikely the Germans would bomb Paris with airships. Strategically, the Germans bombed London to coordinate with their submarine blockade of Britain, aiming for a pincer attack from both inside and outside to force Britain to surrender. Why would they bomb Paris?" Gallieni nodded slightly. Paris was on the mainland and had excellent transportation links. Bombing Paris would be meaningless. Charles continued, "Tactically, London isn't far from the coastline. German airships would have to cross the English Channel to bomb it, which is a vast open ocean. Even with the Royal Navy there, it would be difficult to spot airships overhead." Lieutenant Colonel Fernand understood immediately. Paris is deep inland. For an airship to bomb Paris, it would have to cross hundreds or even thousands of kilometers of land, making it easy for people to spot and report to us in advance. "Yes," Charles continued his analysis, "and once a slow-moving airship is locked on, being tracked and shot down is almost inevitable, unless it can escape back to its own airspace before dawn." "Escape back to its own airspace doesn't seem to help either," Gallieni said. "Indeed," Charles agreed. The French army was equipped with a large number of Camel fighters, which had overwhelming air superiority. Even if the airships escaped back into German airspace, they would still be caught and destroyed. Fernand added, "Even if it returned to base and landed, it might not be safe." "Exactly," Charles nodded. That made sense. With Caproni bombers around, even the airship bases themselves had to worry about being bombed. So, Gallery concluded, they can only develop artillery capable of hitting Paris. Do they really have such artillery? Fernand was still incredulous. To hit Paris from German-controlled territory, it would have to be at least 100 kilometers long. Right, this was unimaginable during World War I, when artillery range was generally around 10 kilometers. Gallery calmly replied, "Think of the Grand Bertha, Lieutenant Colonel. The Germans love to do that." Lieutenant Colonel Fernand was taken aback, then nodded. It seemed to be a German trademark. Once it was confirmed, the command immediately tensed up. The cannon capable of hitting Paris was far superior to airships. If the Germans had successfully developed such a weapon, they could have bombed not only Paris but also the logistical supply routes on the Western Front. If all the roads, railways, and bridges within a 100-kilometer radius of the defensive line were destroyed, the French army would have been truly at a loss for how to defend. They would then be forced to retreat step by step until they lost all their territory. The image above shows the Paris cannon, with a barrel length of 36 meters, exceeding the height of a 10-story building, and a maximum range of 131 kilometers. A total of 9 cannons were produced. One was destroyed by French artillery fire, and another was rendered unusable due to a broken breech block, leaving only 7 ultimately used to bombard Paris. This is actually a misunderstanding. The Germans could indeed develop such a cannon, but only 9 were produced. It was expensive, had low production rates, and poor accuracy. It wasn't mass-produced equipment and therefore served little purpose, serving more as a bluff than a deterrent. Staff officers, upon hearing the word cannon, would immediately conjure images of barrages of artillery fire raining down on the battlefield. However, Charles didn't voice this, because this was exactly what he wanted to see. Only in this way could he exploit anxiety. Perhaps, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand still held a sliver of hope. We can destroy them with bombers. After all, we have air superiority. The advantage of air superiority was that bombers could bomb wherever they wanted. But Charles shook his head, giving a negative answer. If it were me, knowing we didn't have air superiority, I would build a solid concrete fortification to protect those cannons. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand was speechless. The Caproni bombers currently carried small aerial bombs weighing only a few dozen kilograms, which posed no threat to a solid concrete fortification. Just as Charles had hoped, soon news of cannons capable of hitting Paris spread from the city's defense command. This wasn't because the city's defense command was loose-lipped, but because Guerrieri considered this intelligence important and needed to discuss countermeasures as soon as possible, so he immediately reported it to the government and high-ranking military officials. As more people learned of it, the news spread like wildfire, and people discussed it animatedly. If the Germans have cannons like that, Paris will be reduced to ruins. Can't Charles do anything about it? That's a cannon that can fire 100 kilometers away, and it's said the Germans will hide it in fortifications. What can Charles do? I've also heard that Germans will use cannons and airships at the same time. Amidst a panic and doubt, the insurance companies wavered. They might receive more policies and have more money coming in, because people felt their assets were at risk. However, given the precedent of the massive bankruptcy of insurance companies in Dunkirk, they knew their predicament very well. One day, as soon as the Germans fired those long-range cannons, their companies would soon face a flood of hefty claims. However, refusing these high-risk businesses? Then it seemed pointless for the insurance companies to continue operating. At this point, the insurance companies desperately wanted someone to take over their business. The risk was too great, exceeding their capacity to bear it. Joka, busy at the tractor factory, also heard the news. At first, he was astonished that such a cannon existed in the world. However, the Germans had indeed produced many large-caliber artillery pieces, and this was also information from the military, carrying a high degree of credibility. Wait? The military. Joka suddenly realized this was the change Charles had told him about. In other words, this was likely information intentionally released by Charles. The information might be true, or it might be false, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that it could scare the insurance companies. Joka knew then that it was time to buy at rock-bottom prices. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 392 Dramatic Advantage. Paris cannon spread. The Germans were probably completely baffled. It was real. The Germans were indeed implementing the Paris cannon project, and it had even entered the production phase. The Germans were utterly perplexed. How could such a secret, known to only a handful of people even in Germany, be so widely known in France? Who leaked the information? It had to be thoroughly investigated. Charles didn't care about any of that. He only knew that the market had reacted. Large insurance companies were barely holding on, avoiding the risk by raising premiums. Higher risk meant higher premiums. For example, Juris Insurance Company directly doubled its premiums, but made the claims conditions extremely stringent, making it seem like they were cheating. Smaller insurance companies were eager to flee, because nobody knew when the Germans would finish building this cannon. What if it was tomorrow? The Germans would bomb a whole area of houses. Wouldn't all those years of work have been for nothing? Not only would they have worked for nothing, but they would also be left with a mountain of debts they might never be able to repay in their lifetime. It was at this crucial moment that Joka made his move, acquiring 3 small insurance companies and merging them into Bernard Insurance Company. The reason for using Bernard instead of Charles was to avoid giving Charles, the Brigadier General, too much of a connection to capital, providing ammunition for criticism, although everyone knew the real reason. Then, a dramatic scene unfolded. Even though Bernard Insurance Company's premiums were the same as or even higher than other insurance companies, people still poured their money into it. Competitor Juris Insurance Company lowered its premiums again and again, but to no avail. It still couldn't win back customers. Even Joka found this phenomenon strange. He secretly investigated with his assistant why this unusual phenomenon was occurring, and the answer he received was, they believe Charles is a capitalist with a conscience. He keeps his word, so there's no need to worry about claims. Joka hummed in agreement. An insurance company's reputation was crucial, and Charles was unparalleled in this regard. They believe it's the right thing to do to invest in Charles's insurance company because he saved Paris and saved many lives. Joka was stunned. He hadn't considered this aspect. But thinking about it, it makes sense. All of Paris was saved by Charles, and even France. Under these circumstances, it's only natural for Charles to make money. It's better than letting other capitalists who did nothing profit. Some people think Charles will use the money he earns to save those who need it, or to use it on the battlefield, so they're willing to spend the money. Joka was deeply gratified. This was the good reputation Charles had built up. Many more people think this way. They've taken out high premiums in Charles's insurance company, and if Charles doesn't want to lose money, he'll invent something or lead the French army to defeat the Germans with a Paris cannon, so it's worth their money. Some even ask if there's insurance for storming Berlin. If so, they'd be willing to buy it with all their savings. Joker rolled his eyes. That's not insurance, that's gambling. Charles also found this unbelievable. In the past year, he had dealt more with capitalists and had gradually developed the habit of thinking from a profit perspective. Now he realized that doing business requires considering the target audience, talk about profit with capitalists, and about sentiment with ordinary citizens. Now, everything Charles had done before, charity, inventions, and even the reputation he had built in the battlefield, was paying off. The Bernard Insurance Company was rapidly growing, raking in millions of francs a day, and at an ever-increasing pace, breaking the 2 million franc mark in daily premiums within days. More importantly, Charles knew that the German Paris cannon posed no threat to Paris, so this money was practically free. It was insane. Back then, Charles had painstakingly invented the tank and risked his life to lead troops to defend the town of Darvest, only to sell their property rights for a profit of 990,000 francs. Now, he could easily rake in millions a day without doing anything. No wonder modern America was hollowing out its industry due to the financial sector. With money and finance so easy to make, who would bother with real industry? In front of the police training base, beside two guards carrying rifles, Fessenden, wearing an old trench coat, paced anxiously. Fessenden had been waiting there for 3 days, but Charles hadn't come out. His white sideburns were matted from unkempt hair, and his glasses were covered in dust. The image above is a portrait of Fessenden, an American radio expert whose number and variety of inventions were second only to Edison, yet he was almost unknown. During World War I, he researched sonar for Britain. As a scientist, Fessenden held over 500 patents, including one on radio. However, lacking emotional intelligence and shrewdness, his wealth never matched his achievements. Fessenden served as Edison's assistant for 4 years, but Edison dismissed him due to financial problems. He then worked for the U.S. Weather Bureau, a good job paying $3,000 a year and allowing him to retain ownership of all his inventions. However, the Weather Bureau chief attempted to seize half of his patents, forcing him to resign. Next, Fessenden worked for the National Electric Signal Company, NESCO, which also tried to seize his patents, leading to his dismissal once again. This time, Fessenden sued the Electric Signal Company, hoping to get compensation for breach of contract, but the company used its capital to play a game of time with him. Impoverished and desperate, Fessenden cursed, "Isn't there a single good capitalist?" Suddenly, a name flashed through his mind, Charles. People said he was a conscientious capitalist, who invented many devices and supposedly encouraged workers to invent and allowed them to retain the intellectual property rights to their inventions. Then Fessenden hesitated. Charles was more interested in inventing war equipment, and he seemed to have nothing of use. Suddenly, Fessenden remembered his echo sounder used to detect icebergs. Perhaps it could be useful to Charles. So Fessenden made up his mind, bought a ship ticket, and traveled thousands of miles to France. When Fessenden found Charles's residence, he realized he had oversimplified things. Charles wasn't someone anyone could meet, especially since he was a foreigner easily mistaken for a spy. He couldn't wait any longer. Fessenden gritted his teeth and decided to take the risk. Thinking this, he straightened his coat, strode towards the base gate, and confidently told the guard, "I want to see Charles. I have important intelligence about the Germans that I need to report to him in person." Chapter 393 Talent delivered to the door. It was an ordinary morning. Charles got up and sat at his desk, munching on the bread his orderly had brought him, without washing his face or brushing his teeth. This seemed unhygienic. The old Charles wouldn't have done this. But after returning from the Gallipoli battlefield, experiencing the blood-stained mud in excrement-scented tunnels, and the stench of rotting corpses in the air, he no longer cared. Tigeny waved a newspaper at Charles and said, "Amazing, isn't it? You can even see human bones." "What?" Charles mumbled, his mouth full of food. Tigeny handed the newspaper to Charles, pointing to a picture. "This is Marie Curie's invention." Charles paused when he heard Marie Curie, his chewing unconsciously slowing. Charles knew who Marie Curie was, of course. He had grown up hearing her name. He just hadn't realized that Marie Curie existed in the same time and space as him. Charles turned his gaze to the newspaper, where a large headline on the front page read, "Little Curie family has helped over 100,000 wounded soldiers receive proper treatment." The picture showed a car with Marie Curie sitting inside, her gaze somewhat melancholic. Charles learned from the article that the car was invented by Marie Curie. It was equipped with a radiographic device and could be driven to field hospitals to take X-rays of wounded soldiers. Marie Curie called it Little Curie family. The picture above shows Marie Curie in her radiographic medical vehicle. During World War I, she established France's first military radiographic imaging center, equipped with 20 mobile X-ray machines, and also deployed 200 X-ray machines in a field hospital. During the war, 1 million wounded and sick soldiers received treatment using X-ray equipment. "A great woman," Charles exclaimed sincerely. Tigeny hummed in agreement, then shrugged. "Unfortunately, the French public doesn't seem to approve of her." "Don't approve?" Charles looked at Tigeny in surprise. "Why?" Tigeny turned to Charles, his face filled with doubt and surprise. "You haven't heard?" "Everyone in France knows," Charles said. "Oh, I rarely pay attention to outside affairs, except for reading." Tigeny rolled his eyes. Clearly, he'd been too strictly controlled by his parents. "It was about 3 years ago," Tigeny explained. "Madame Curie wrote a love letter, which was published in the Paris News. Then people knew that Curie was dating Professor Langevin, who was a student of Curie's late husband." Charles smiled lightly. "What's so special about that? Just a teacher-student relationship." Unexpectedly, Tigeny added, "Professor Langevin was married." Charles was speechless. He hadn't heard of that. Tigeny raised a hand. Then the rumors started. Many people believe the affair began before her husband's death. Some even said he committed suicide because of it, and some even suspected a conspiracy. Charles sighed inwardly. He seemed to understand why Madame Curie always looked so lonely and melancholy in photographs. Taking a sip of milk, Charles shook his head and sighed. "The French are strange. They praise the promiscuous Harley to the skies, yet cannot tolerate such a small stain as Marie. This is the indulgent and romantic France." Tigeny was taken aback, seemingly finding Charles's words reasonable. After thinking for a while, Tigeny offered a barely plausible explanation. "Perhaps people have higher expectations of scientists. Just as they have high expectations of you." Charles slammed his empty glass on the table, glaring fiercely at Tigeny. "So, that's why you called Harley to my bathroom." Tigeny was stunned. He hadn't expected Charles to connect the dots. "Damn it," Tigeny slapped his forehead. "How could I not have thought of that? I should have brought a few reporters and cameras with me that day. I missed a perfect headline." Charles threw the leftover bread at him. "That glib-tongued fellow." But Charles understood that this wasn't just because Marie Curie was a scientist, but also because she was a woman, and in that era, there was still serious discrimination and prejudice against women. "General," at this moment, a guard ran up to Charles and reported, "Someone wants to see you, an American. He says he has important intelligence about the Germans." Charles's first thought was of the Lady in White, an organization mostly composed of civilians from various countries. But then he thought something was off. Members of the Lady in White shouldn't be so reckless. Coming to his door would almost expose their identities. "Let him in," Charles ordered, with a hint of doubt. Tigeny became more cautious. He asked the guard, "Have you searched him?" "Yes," the guard replied. "No weapons, and nothing suspicious." Charles led the man to the conference room. To him, the white-haired old man didn't look like a spy at all. "You can speak now," Charles nodded to him. "What do you want to tell me?" "Well, General," the old man looked a little nervous. He rubbed his hands and swallowed. 2 years ago, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank. Since then, I've been considering something. My thought is this." Charles was somewhat surprised. "The Titanic sank 2 years ago? So close to home. This has nothing to do with the Germans, does it?" Charles joked. "You mean it was sunk by the Germans?" "No, of course not." The old man blushed. After hesitating for a moment, he answered, "I'm very sorry, General. I actually have no information about the Germans." Perhaps this is a fan, Charles thought, using the pretense of providing information to get an autograph. "Where's the notebook?" Charles asked. The old man looked at Charles with a bewildered expression. "What notebook? Where should I sign?" Charles took a pen from the drawer. "Don't use that method again next time." The old man paused for a moment before reacting. No, I didn't come for an autograph." "Then what is it?" Charles asked, somewhat embarrassed. "I am." The old man paused, then took a deep breath, seemingly resigned. "My name is Fessenden, a general, a radio researcher. For the past 2 years, because of the Titanic's sinking, I've been researching methods for underwater iceberg detection. I recently applied for industrial patents for an echo detector, which can detect icebergs 2 miles away. I think this might be useful to you. Charles's eyes widened instantly. A radio expert? An echo detector for detecting icebergs? And 2 miles away at that, isn't that the prototype of sonar? How did such a talent end up at his doorstep? Chapter 394 Talent Development Plan. We can use the echo sounder to probe shipping routes, General Fessenden said. It can make our routes more precise and safer. It can detect reefs, shoals, shipwrecks, and other obstacles, and we can use it to explore new routes. Charles looked at Fessenden incredulously. That's all. Hearing this, Fessenden's enthusiasm instantly vanished. Yes, all of this could be done manually, and the existing routes were sufficient. The naval charts used by the military had been repeatedly probed. Why go to unnecessary trouble? Thinking this, Fessenden hesitated, his eyes filled with frustration, and said listlessly, I'm sorry, General, this was just my personal idea. I regret wasting your valuable time. No, Charles explained, I mean, you think the echo sounder is only for probing shipping routes? Of course, it does have that function, and we desperately need it to further enhance the safety of our routes. Fessenden's eyes lit up. This meant Charles was interested. However, Fessenden asked doubtfully, but besides that, what else can it do? Fessenden was a scientist, he didn't know much about military equipment, and that was all he could think of. Charles was speechless for a moment. It was precisely because he hadn't thought of that, despite having created sonar, the ultimate inventor was someone else. Detecting submarines, sir, Charles reminded him. If your echo detector can detect icebergs and reefs, can't it also detect submarines? Fessenden's eyes widened suddenly, and after a long pause, he nodded excitedly. Yes, General, it can, I'm sure of it. All we need to do is change the wavelength. I mean, some wavelengths are more easily reflected by metal, and increase the receiver's sensitivity, so we can detect submarines, even though they're moving. We can also determine the submarine's distance based on the reception duration, and then calculate its location by combining that with the direction of the sound waves. Charles nodded slightly. Sonar was invented in 1906, but it wasn't actually sonar, it should be called a hydrophone, because it was purely for listening to the sounds of enemy submarine engines and propellers underwater. It was operated by sailors with keen hearing who underwent certain training. Active sonar appeared in 1915, invented by Professor Langevin, a physicist who had a rumored affair with Marie Curie. However, before that, Fessenden had already invented active sonar, but its purpose was not for submarines. It was called an echo detector. Fessenden was both surprised and delighted, and he looked at Charles expectantly. So, General, you will hire me, of course. Charles nodded firmly. Although France didn't have much need for anti-submarine warfare, such talent and technology absolutely could not fall into British hands. Moreover, Fessenden was a radio expert, his inventions covered many fields, and he was proficient in physics, chemistry, mathematics, architecture, astronomy. It was hard to imagine that such an inventive genius could be placed in a position of power with just a small amount of money. At this point, Fessenden hesitated. I have a favor to ask, General. While I work for you, may I retain the industrial property rights to my inventions? Of course. Charles nodded firmly. I do the same for my workers, and you will certainly be no exception. This was a major lure to attract talent. Charles then added, however, due to the war, I hope I have the right of first refusal to purchase your industrial property rights. If you are unwilling to sell, we can cooperate, but there will be at least a 3 to 5 year confidentiality period. Fessenden understood. No one would willingly leak advanced military equipment to the enemy. This wasn't just a matter of industrial property rights, it was treason, espionage, and endangering national security. Besides, it didn't matter who he sold to. If the price was right, why not sell to Charles? I agree, Fessenden nodded readily. He was hesitant to discuss salary. A high salary was a pipe dream for him now. He only hoped to meet his basic living needs. Charles seemed to read Fessenden's mind and calmly said, 5,000 francs a month, room and board included. Fessenden didn't immediately grasp the meaning. As an American, he instinctively converted the figure to dollars. At the current exchange rate, 5,000 francs was about $330. That year. God, a $4,000 annual salary. This far exceeded his previous highest salary. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Charles asked. Charles could easily have asked for a higher salary. A few thousand francs a month was nothing to him at the time, especially since these expenses would be recouped many times over later. But Charles knew that to retain talent, he couldn't offer too low a salary or too high one. If he offered too much, they would feel they had enough after a few years and often choose to resign and focus on their own research. No, there's nothing to add. Fessenden quickly stepped forward to shake hands with Charles. I agree, General. A 3-year contract? Charles asked. Or 5, Fessenden quickly replied. I hope for 5 years, General. Such a good job, such generous terms. Of course, the longer the better. Charles got up and went outside to instruct his staff to draft the contract. Then he sat back down to discuss the details with Fessenden. I will set up a laboratory for you, sir. You can list the equipment you need, your requirements for the laboratory, and the like. Fessenden stared at Charles in disbelief. You mean, a personal laboratory? I can make any requests, his own laboratory. This was a distant dream for Fessenden, but now it was within reach. Yes, Charles nodded. You can also choose the assistants you need. If they are willing, I will hire them as well. Fessenden's mouth hung open. This was clearly funding his research and allowing him to retain industrial ownership. Had he misheard? I don't understand, General, Fessenden said. All this you've done is just for the echo detector. Charles could easily buy the intellectual property rights. That would be much cheaper than setting up a laboratory. No, Charles shook his head. There's also radio, sir, and much more. For example, the formula for torpedo explosives. With this lab, Charles would have the perfect excuse. Radios also needed miniaturization. They could be mounted on cars and fighter jets, thus comprehensively upgrading the Army's fighters, especially the fighters. Furthermore, the aerodynamic layout of fighter jets required hydrodynamic solutions. If necessary, vacuum tubes could be developed into transistors. This was, in fact, Charles's talent development plan. Chapter 395 The Reactions to St. Etienne II. Charles signed the contract with Fessenden in the name of Bernard Company, and the laboratory was located in the small town of Lavas. This was to avoid potential trouble in the future. If the contract were signed in the name of the military, Fessenden and the personnel he trained would belong to the military, and if Joffre needed them one day, he could simply transfer them away as commander-in-chief. Signing the contract in the name of the company would avoid such problems. They would be company property and would have nothing to do with the military. It must be said that Charles's dual identity as a military officer and capitalist was very useful. He could not only use his military influence to strike at his opponents, but also legitimately and legally poach personnel from the military. As for Fessenden, as long as he could collect money, live, and continue his research, he wouldn't care who the client was. That day, Charles was discussing the training curriculum for the 105th Infantry Regiment with Tycoon. During this period, Charles's M1 armored vehicle had been launched. It was equipped with a 180-horsepower car engine and could carry 8 fully armed soldiers to move on roads at a speed of 81 kilometers per hour. Because this armored vehicle was simple to produce, it was essentially a car with armor added around its sides to stop ordinary bullets. The monthly production was only around 100 vehicles. If Charles wanted, this production could be increased. After equipping the 1st Tank Brigade, Charles began equipping the 105th Infantry Regiment with it. Tycoon didn't understand Charles's approach. He waved the armored vehicle data sheet at Charles. What's the use of equipping us with this kind of vehicle? Its carrying capacity is less than a regular car, its armor and firepower are inferior to a tank, and it can't even stop the German K rounds. The 13mm thick armor indeed couldn't stop K rounds, and by this time the German army was widely equipped with K rounds, with ordinary soldiers carrying 5 rounds each. Do you think the Germans have time to replace their K rounds? Charles countered calmly. What? Tycoon didn't understand Charles's meaning. It won't take long, and besides, we can't rely on the enemy not having time to change to K rounds. This is the battlefield. You're right, General, Charles replied. But if these armored vehicles are following behind tanks, do you think the Germans will choose to load ordinary bullets or K rounds into their guns? Tycoon was speechless. Of course, they would choose ordinary bullets, because K rounds also cannot penetrate tank armor. Then Tycoon understood. Then, the armored vehicle can suddenly fill the gaps between the tanks and suppress the enemy with machine guns. Charles nodded. It is a compliment to the tank. Tanks are slow and have poor external detection capabilities, while armored vehicles are the opposite. They are fast and have strong external detection capabilities, making them especially suitable for night raids. Charles emphasized the words night raid. Tycoon instantly understood. The Battle of Cambrai had been written into military academy textbooks as a classic battle, and Tycoon had studied the entire battle process, every detail. At the time, the French army easily defeated the heavily armed German Upper Silesia tanks with the Saint M21 light tank. Now, Charles was simply converting the Saint M21 into the M1 armored vehicle. The M1 armored vehicle might perform even better in night combat, as it had stronger external detection capabilities, higher speed, and greater mobility, while its firepower and defense were comparable to the Saint M21. "You're always right," Tycoon replied helplessly. Charles smiled but didn't speak. In fact, he had another plan, to use the M1 armored vehicle to create a storm commando unit for the French army. As soon as the submachine guns were fired, the M1 armored vehicle could lead a group of special forces at speeds of tens of kilometers per hour into the enemy trenches to open a breach, or to raid important targets in the enemy's rear. Just then, Dominic appeared at the office door, excitedly reporting to Charles with a telegram in hand. "General, the feedback on the Saint Etienne machine gun is coming." The telegram was sent by maintenance personnel from the Saint Etienne arsenal, who had been monitoring the usage of the Saint Etienne machine gun through them. Charles took the telegram and read, "French soldiers have largely abandoned the Chauchat machine gun. They are fighting with other units for the Saint Etienne machine gun, and have even clashed with British and Anzac troops." Clashes. Charles looked at Dominic with suspicion. Infighting on the battlefield was no small matter. Serious consequences could even lead to execution. Dominic raised an eyebrow. It started as a minor skirmish. French soldiers were indignant, believing that French machine guns should be prioritized for the French. Then it escalated, and both sides fought recklessly in the trenches. Charles was speechless. If the Ottoman army had seized the opportunity to launch a counter-offensive, would the Allied forces have collapsed? But this seemed normal. Soldiers from different countries, cultures, languages, and even skin colors, working together, were bound to develop internal conflicts over time. The Saint Etienne II machine gun was merely the fuse. Just then, the phone on his desk rang. It was Galini, summoning Charles to the city defense headquarters. Charles brandished the telegram in his hand, declaring, "For this matter." Charles was right. As he walked up the stairs to the second floor and appeared at the entrance to the operations department, Galini beckoned him over. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" Galini asked. "I don't know what you mean, General." Charles feigned ignorance. Galini, expressionless, exposed Charles's lie. "The performance difference between the Chauchat and the Saint Etienne is too great, Brigadier General, so great that even a fool could see which is better." "Yet you didn't stop the military from purchasing and equipping themselves with the Chauchat," Charles replied. "I just didn't want the Saint Etienne machine guns to be stolen, General." "What?" Galini was taken aback. Charles explained, "The Chauchat machine gun was also designed by the Saint Etienne arsenal, but now it belongs to the Pitot arsenal." Galini seemed to understand. This was a power struggle between capitalists. Charles was telling the truth, but intentionally misleading Galini. Charles believed Galini didn't need to know too much, and he didn't want to involve Galini in the capitalists' conflict. Galini seemed to understand Charles's intentions as well. He nodded slightly in understanding and didn't ask any further questions. "So, ordering the Saint Etienne is no problem, is it?" Galiri asked. "How many can you produce per month?" "No problem," Charles replied confidently. 3,000 per month, General." "How many do you need?" Galiri smiled slightly. 3,000 per month. This showed they had long been prepared to leave their opponents no way out. Chapter 396. You played a significant role. The May night in Paris, like a flirtatious woman, quietly descended upon this city of light. Lights gradually illuminated the riverbanks, appearing from afar, the water shimmering red against the night sky, like countless stars fallen to earth. The leaves of the plane trees rustled gently in the breeze, seemingly discussing the day's battles. Note, during the reign of Louis XIV, Paris underwent a large-scale development of its sewer and lighting systems, making it the world's first city with public lighting at night. Thousands of candlelight streetlights illuminated 912 streets, earning it the nickname City of Light. At that moment, Charles was sound asleep in his dormitory when he was suddenly awakened by a cheer. He sat bolt upright in bed, his mind still fogged up, and his feet instinctively opened the door in the dark, running towards the command post from which the sound had come. This was a habit Charles had developed during battles. Sometimes he felt his body and soul were separate, the former acting instinctively according to wartime procedures, requiring no conscious thought. When Charles arrived at the command post, Tigeny was already there, along with several staff officers, all in their pajamas, looking bewildered at the communications officer on duty. "General," the communications officer excitedly reported to Charles, "they've joined us. Italy. Just now, they declared war on Austria-Hungary and urgently mobilized their troops." Everyone was stunned for a moment, then erupted in cheers like the communications officer, some even hugging each other in celebration. Only Charles remained calm, thinking to himself, "I thought it was something big, just this." Charles grunted, casually handed the telegram back to the communications officer, yawned, and turned to walk towards the barracks. Tigeny quickly caught up from behind, his tone slightly puzzled. "Brigadier General, you don't seem to care about this." "Should I care?" Charles slowed his pace and asked. "Of course," Tigeny replied, "a country joining us, and through your efforts, isn't that a major victory? This war could have ended because of it, but you don't seem to care at all." Tigeny looked Charles up and down, as if nothing had happened. Charles stared incredulously at Tigeny. These guys actually thought the war might end because of Italy's entry. But thinking about it, it seemed logical. The Allied powers and the Central powers were evenly matched at the moment, and Italy's entry should theoretically have easily tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. But Charles knew that wasn't the case. Historically, Italy had amassed over 1 million troops for an attack, only to be held back by a few 100,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers along the Isonzo River. Later, when Germany recovered and sent reinforcements, Italy was almost annihilated. Should Charles cheer for this ally? And still delude himself into thinking the war would end because of it? Charles sighed softly, glancing at Tigeny with pity. "I'll keep dreaming." "You keep dreaming." Without further explanation, he went into his dormitory, closed the door, and collapsed onto his bed like a zombie. He thought to himself, "Tomorrow I should tell the communications officer not to make a fuss about Italy and disturb my sleep." In fact, it wasn't just Tigeny who thought this way. The citizens of Paris, the French people, and even the entire Allied military and civilian population shared this view. This was Italy, after all, a great power capable of easily mobilizing millions of troops. The French army currently numbered only 1 million, and with that force, they were already fighting the Germans on equal terms. For Italy, with 1 million troops against the weakest of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a 5-fold numerical advantage, wouldn't that be as easy as crossing a bridge? The next morning, when people saw the news in the newspapers, all of Paris was in an uproar. Cheers echoed through the streets, and people discussed it enthusiastically. "Charles has dealt a heavy blow to the Central powers. The victory at Cambrai has secured Italy's support, and Italy's entry will completely end this war. Yes, this makes Gallipoli seem less important. The Central powers' flank is exposed to Italian forces. No, the victory at Gallipoli is equally important. It can tie down Central powers." By now, many citizens had gone from being completely ignorant about military affairs to becoming semi-experts, able to offer some insightful analysis of the battle situation, some of which was quite reasonable. After getting up, Charles ate the bread his orderly brought him as usual, and soon received a call from General Winter. "You played a significant role in this, Brigadier General," General Winter said. "I know," Charles replied lazily. "Everyone's saying it's the victory at the Battle of Cambrai." "I'm sick of hearing it. You think it's the Battle of Cambrai?" The voice on the phone carried a hint of amusement. "What else could it be?" Charles asked, puzzled. General Winter replied, "I already said, you played a significant role, Brigadier General." Charles then understood General Winter's meaning. It was because of Charles. Charles wasn't wrong. This time, the Italian side sent someone to negotiate with General Winter, not for Foreign Minister San Lino, but for the seasoned 65-year-old Italian chief of the General Staff, Luigi Cadorna. The moment General Winter saw Cadorna appear, he knew it was pretty much a done deal. This was a heavyweight figure in the Italian military. His presence meant Italy was ready to declare war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. General Winter felt a sense of relief and handed over the prepared documents, saying respectfully, "General, these are the details of the Battle of Cambrai. We advanced a total of 8 kilometers and annihilated tens of thousands of German troops. Clearly, we are winning. General Winter had assumed that this was what Cadorna was most concerned about. The Allied victory meant Italy hadn't chosen the wrong side. However, Cadorna didn't open the documents, he didn't even glance at them. That's not what I want to know, Lieutenant General. Cadorna's voice was slightly hoarse, but his tone was steady. I want to know about Charles, and his inventions. Are those legends true? General Winter was taken aback. Of course they are true, General. Then General Winter became tense again. It's just that I didn't prepare any information about him. A hint of regret flashed in Cadorna's eyes. Seeing that the negotiations were about to reach another stalemate, General Winter quickly added, but I am a good friend of Charles, General. We met in Antwerp when he was a second lieutenant. I know everything about him, including his inventions. Is that so? Cardinal looked at General Winter with interest. I'm ready, Lieutenant General. Tell me what you know. Chapter 397. This is Charles's method. General Winter recounted with great enthusiasm how Charles lured the German Big Bertha into firing range at Antwerp, then used Congreve rockets mounted on his aircraft to shoot down the German airship, followed by his invention of depth charges to destroy submarines, and his personal command of troops on the battlefield, turning the tide of the Gallipoli campaign. He even recounted Charles's feint tactics against Gallipoli without reservation. Finally, General Winter sighed. Charles was right. If we had attacked the Dardanelles from the beginning according to his plan, we wouldn't be in this stalemate. Our fleet should have already entered the Sea of Marmara, or even achieved victory. Now I deeply regret it. After listening to General Winter's account, Cadorna nodded secretly. Winter's words were flawless. If it were a lie, it couldn't have been delivered so perfectly without preparation. At this moment, the hesitant Cadorna finally made his decision. The victory at the Battle of Cambrai was far more important than the victory at the Battle of Charles. With a military genius like Charles, Allied victory was only a matter of time, and Italy's allegiance to the Allies was a foregone conclusion. However, Cadorna, representing Italy, still made a series of demands. In addition to the Austro-Hungarian mainland, Italy can also obtain the territories of Croatia, Slovenia, and Albania after the war. At this point, Cadorna completely disregarded Austria-Hungary, believing that the exhausted Austro-Hungarian army was easily defeated, and therefore naturally expanded the requested territory beyond Austria-Hungary. No problem, General Winter readily agreed, locating the locations Cadorna mentioned on the map, which did not conflict with the British and French forces. And there are interests in Africa, Cadorna continued. We hope that after Britain and France acquire German colonies in Africa, they can transfer a portion of their colonies in Northeast Africa to Italy. General Winter was taken aback. Was this an attempt to snatch teeth from the jaws of Britain and France? After only a moment's hesitation, General Winter nodded and said, I personally have no objection, but the specifics need to be discussed with London and Paris. This answer reassured Cadorna, as this was indeed not something General Winter could decide on his own. Furthermore, Cadorna added as a final condition, Britain and France should guarantee that the Adriatic Sea will become an inland lake of Italy after the war, and agree to amend the borders between Tunisia and Libya, and Egypt and Libya. General Winter located the locations on the map and said earnestly, this also needs to be discussed, General. Of course, Cadorna replied. Soon after, General Winter sent the conditions offered by Italy to the British and French sides one by one. The British and French governments made a show of it, convening their political leaders overnight to discuss the matter, and only reluctantly agreed several hours later. Cadorna was very satisfied with the outcome of the negotiations, and after the meeting, he began to assemble troops and declare war on Austria-Hungary. What he didn't know was that Britain and France had never intended to honor the treaty from the beginning. They were determined that Italy could conquer wherever it pleased. What Italy conquered, they couldn't control, but what Britain and France conquered, they certainly wouldn't easily hand over. Much less cede their former African colonies to Italy. Note, after the war, Italy received nothing. Britain and France argued that Italy had contributed almost nothing and therefore refused to honor the treaty. Italy couldn't do anything about it, suffering the loss of millions of soldiers and a devastating economic blow due to the war. Paris, Schneider Arms Factory. James, sitting at his desk, listlessly rubbed his aching forehead. James felt no joy at the good news of Italy joining the Allies. It wasn't his concern. He was overwhelmed by a series of problems that had suddenly arisen. First, the Battle of Cambrai had caused the Saint-Simon tank to completely lose military orders, both heavy and light. Even though the light M21 achieved a victory, The soldiers unanimously believed it was due to the night raid, which couldn't mask the fact that the M21 was an extremely dangerous piece of equipment, posing a threat to their own side. Secondly, Charles imported 5 artillery production lines from Britain. Each line was said to be able to produce 6 large-caliber guns, totaling 30, while Schneider's 105mm guns only produced 5 per month. This huge difference would put the 105mm gun at a significant disadvantage in the market, even if it was potentially superior. The most troublesome issue is the machine gun controversy that had just erupted in Gallipoli. The machine gun itself wasn't the problem. James knew he had fallen into a carefully laid trap by Charles. He had invested over 70 million francs to quickly expand production, and had over 20,000 machine guns in stock, all of which were wasted due to the appearance of the Saint Etienne II machine gun. The total loss was estimated at over 100 million, James guessed. However, Schneider had deep pockets and could afford to lose. The fatal flaw was that everyone believed this was yet another behind-the-scenes maneuver by Schneider to suppress Charles, a dirty political deal, and collusion between the military and businesses, so people spontaneously took to the streets, gathering in front of the Schneider factory, chanting, "Schneider is preventing a French victory. Stop this shameless behavior, we need Charles, not Schneider. Schneider is killing frontline soldiers with its terrible weapons and despicable methods. We'd be better off without Schneider." Accompanying these shouts were stones, rotten leaves, and rotten eggs thrown at the factory. James was puzzled. He asked Pauline, "Did I forget? We don't seem to have suppressed Charles in terms of machine guns." "No, you haven't forgotten, sir," Pauline replied. "We certainly haven't. It's Charles's doing." "Charles's doing?" James looked confused. "You mean, the demonstrators were hired by Charles?" Pauline shook her head. "Charles may not have done anything, but people will naturally point the finger at us." James instantly understood. Similar incidents had happened so many times that people, out of habit, assumed it was Schneider's doing again. In the past, James would have ignored it, let them make a scene, they couldn't do anything to Schneider. But this time was different. Schneider's workers also protested with a strike, and people began boycotting Schneider products because they believed Schneider was a heartless capitalist who only cared about its own profits, disregarding soldiers' lives and national security. If this continued, it wouldn't be long before Schneider was kicked out of the competition, even with money and technology. Just then, the phone rang. Pauline rushed forward, answered, and looked at James in surprise. "Jouka wants to talk to you, sir." "Jouka?" James looked puzzled. "Charles' father, what does he want?" Then a flash of anger crossed his eyes. "He definitely wants to see me defeated by Charles." Chapter 398 Gift. "Hey, Jouka." James greeted Jouka with a smile as he appeared at the door, shaking his hand warmly. "It's a pleasure to see you. I wanted to visit you when I passed through Darvaz last time, but they said you were always busy at the factory." This was a polite remark. James hadn't left Paris at all during this period. "Yes, there's been a lot going on at the factory lately," Jouka replied. "How is it going? The insurance company must have made a good profit, right?" James asked casually. "Just so-so," Jouka chuckled lightly. "Besides, you can't really say profit, the risks during wartime are unpredictable." James grunted, took 2 glasses of red wine from Pauline, and handed one to Jouka. Charles was right. No one can compare to him in this regard, just like his bombing of the steel mill. James's words were barbed, but his expression remained amiable, as if conversing with a long-lost friend. Jouka chuckled. Charles was just doing his best to defeat the enemy. This was a double entendre. The enemy could refer to the Germans on the battlefield or the capitalists in the business world who were targeting Charles. James paused, then exchanged a knowing smile with Djokovic. After a brief exchange of words, they both knew the other was no pushover. However, unlike last time, Djokovic was much more relaxed. He wore his usual old suit, but appeared more confident and poised. James, on the other hand, seemed nervous. He was feigning it, not wanting Djokovic to see his anxiety. "You've come this time," James said, settling as gracefully as possible onto the sofa, raising his glass of red wine towards Djokovic. "Not to blow up someplace again, are you?" "Of course not, Mr. James," Djokovic replied. "I'm here to discuss a collaboration." "A collaboration?" James feigned surprise. In truth, he had already guessed that Djokovic's intention was likely to buy some valuable assets from Schneider while Schneider was facing internal and external difficulties. Yes, Joka said with a helpless expression. Bernard Company isn't having an easy time either, Mr. James. Although we've bought the steel mill, we lack both technology and talent. The mill is still in German-controlled territory and hasn't been recaptured. Joka then shook his head self-deprecatingly. I don't know when we'll be able to produce qualified steel ourselves, James grunted in agreement, understanding the implication in Joka's words. You're hoping to buy smelting and forging technology from me to prepare for the steel mill, Joka nodded heavily. Yes, Mr. James. It would be even better if you could transfer some skilled workers, James smiled slightly. When do you need them? The sooner the better, Joka replied. I've set up an experimental plant in Darvaz, intending to train a group of qualified workers first. You know, it's about preparing for the takeover of the factory, James nodded approvingly. A very good idea. As he lowered his head to drink, a hint of disappointment flashed in his eyes. His previous statement had been a test. If Joka had given a specific time frame, James would have known that Charles wanted to acquire the steel mill before then. James could then use the Germans to create trouble for Charles. However, Joka tactfully gave a vague answer. After a moment's consideration, James replied, No problem, Mr. Joka. Since you've requested it, I'll do my best to fulfill it. Please provide a list another day, thank you very much. Joka eagerly pulled a document from his briefcase and handed it over. James's smile was somewhat unnatural. This wasn't his wish. Skilled workers were a valuable asset to the company, some even involving trade secrets that couldn't be easily transferred. However, James knew he couldn't stop it. Charles didn't actually need James's approval. The workers were currently on strike outside, Charles only needed to rally them, and most would flock to Charles's factory. Charles needed James's consent to ease tensions, at least that's what James thought. This was advantageous to James, as he could publicly announce that Schneider and Charles had reached some level of cooperation, thus mitigating public protests and resistance against Schneider. James took the form and glanced at it, finding no problems. Joka didn't need many people and had carefully avoided sensitive positions, clearly having prepared beforehand. Furthermore, Joka added, I heard your company has a batch of Saint Salmon vehicles sitting unsold in the warehouse. I can buy them at 10,000 francs each, perfect for worker training. If the price is right, I can also purchase the industrial rights to the Saint Salmon vehicles to avoid any ownership disputes. James was surprised. There were over 100 Saint Salmon vehicles piling up in the warehouse, originally destined for scrap metal, but now they could be sold for 10,000 francs each, plus the industrial rights, easily 2 million francs. Although it wasn't a huge sum, every penny counted, so he agreed without much thought. James never imagined that Joka's roundabout way of buying the Saint Salmon vehicles, seemingly as a side benefit, was actually what he truly wanted. More precisely, what Charles truly wanted. When Joka heard Charles's idea on the phone, he couldn't understand. Are you crazy, Charles? Buy Saint Salmon, isn't that something that's been defeated by the Germans time and time again on the battlefield? People have already decided it's unsuitable for the battlefield. Your Charles A1 is far superior, and you want to buy it now. Charles didn't explain much, he simply replied, that's because they don't know how to use it, father. Saint Salmon isn't useless, it can find its place on the battlefield. Seeing Charles's insistence, Joka stopped objecting. After all, a few million francs was just a small sum, let's buy it. However, the next second, Joka felt troubled. James isn't short of money, Charles. If we directly tell him our intention to buy it, he'll definitely guess that Saint Salmon has value he hasn't considered, which will make the purchase more difficult. Yes, Charles calmly replied, so, we should make it look like a trivial freebie. A freebie? Joka was taken aback. Yes, a freebie, Charles explained. Our steel mill needs workers, and the workers need to observe and practice, preferably on old, decommissioned tanks, so we need St. Shimon Djokovic, on the other end of the phone, stared wide-eyed for a long moment, unable to process what he was seeing. Was this really the Charles he used to know? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 399 Why Can't It Be a Canon? Throughout the signing process, James didn't notice any problems. His entire focus was on how to utilize the deal. Immediately after signing, He announced, "We have reached an agreement with Bernard Company and will soon be supplying them with a group of talents in smelting, forging, and other fields. We are also transferring the industrial property rights of St. Chamont to Bernard Company. I believe this is a crucial step in the cooperation between Schneider and Bernard Company against their enemies. We will work together to make France great again." As James expected, the public protests and boycotts quickly subsided after the announcement. People thought that since Schneider had already cooperated with Charles, similar incidents would not happen again. The two companies could share resources and unite against external threats, a boon for France. James was somewhat smug. Back in his office, he opened a bottle of champagne to celebrate, thinking that Charles, after all, was young. He only thought about industrial development and overlooked the potential benefits the deal might bring to Schneider. However, Paulina, having just finished her call, hurriedly approached James, her face serious. "Sir," she said, "only a small portion of the St. Samont tanks were shipped to Darvaz. The majority went to the police training base." James's expression changed. He looked up at Paulina, his hands unconsciously slowing their movements. "Police training base?" he asked. Then, James offered a plausible explanation. "Perhaps Charles wants to use the St. Samont for exercises, or for soldiers to observe." Paulina didn't object. That was indeed possible. However, Paulina added, "It could also be for training, sir." James's face darkened. Though he continued opening the champagne, his mind replayed every detail of the negotiations with Djokovic. The more he thought about it, the more something seemed amiss. Finally, he put down the bottle, sighed softly, and sat back in his chair. "We've been tricked, Paulina," James said dejectedly. "What Charles really wants is the St. Samont." Paulina nodded slightly. She had also realized this. Charles could have easily acquired skilled smelters and forging technicians and talent through various means, including direct recruitment from the public, but he specifically chose to seek them out from Schneider. Therefore, it's more likely that his true intentions lay elsewhere, a tactic Charles used to conceal his real purpose. James stared blankly at the empty table before him. Charles's painstaking acquisition of St. Cham indicated its value, something Schneider hadn't yet recognized. In Schneider's hands, St. Cham was worthless, but in Charles's, it could shine like gold. "Should we have a meeting to discuss this?" Paulina asked. James shook his head helplessly. It was pointless now. The industrial property rights were already in Charles's hands. Even if he knew its value, what difference would it make? James only hoped that the value wasn't too high, otherwise, he would be treating a treasure as scrap. More importantly, he might be handing Charles an opportunity, a chance to revitalize Schneider and pull it out of Charles's shadow. People would even say, "Look, Saint only loses under Schneider, but shines under Charles." James wanted to slap himself twice. He had actually sold this opportunity for 2 million francs. 2 million. One Saint after another drove into the police training base, and everyone found it unbelievable, including Tigeny. "So, you really bought Saint?" Tigeny stared expressionlessly at the long line of Saint. Charles raised his head. "You've already seen it. Is there a problem with the production of Charles A1? Tigeny asked. Then he seemed to understand something. "I see, the military hasn't procured enough Charles A1s, so you can only buy St. Chams at a low price to fill the gap. I can fill this funding gap, Brigadier General. I can afford the equipment for a whole regiment." Charles waited quietly for Tigeny to finish speaking, then calmly replied, "That's not the reason, General." "Then what is it?" Tigeny's eyes showed some resentment, and his tone was somewhat agitated. "I heard that the 1st Tank Brigade has been fully equipped with Charles A1s, and the M1 armored vehicles were also first issued to the 1st Tank Brigade before being issued to the 105th Infantry Regiment." "Yes, I know. We are an infantry regiment and it is a tank brigade, but we can't use St. Chams to make up the numbers, Brigadier General. It will only bring us trouble. It will kill many of us." Charles asked in return, "Is that your view?" "That's the consensus, Brigadier General." Tigeny raised his hand to the officers and soldiers of the 105th Infantry Regiment who were watching on both sides. "Look at them." Charles's gaze swept across the entire area. Just as Tigeny had predicted, almost all the officers and soldiers wore expressions of disdain. Some soldiers looked relieved. They were already equipped with M1 armored vehicles and Charles A1 tanks, knowing they were unlikely to receive the St. Salmon. "Relax, General," Charles replied. "I guarantee that if you don't want to be equipped with a St. Salmon, I'll replace them all with Charles A1s." "Are you serious?" Tigony's eyes lit up. Of course, Charles answered decisively. If the military doesn't order, I will, on behalf of the Bernard Company, donate one to the 105th Infantry Regiment for every one. Is it a deal? Tigony's face lit up with joy. It's a deal, Charles nodded with a smile. This Tigony guy seemed to have already treated the 105th Infantry Regiment as his own property, trying every means to equip it. You're doomed, Brigadier General. Tigony turned his gaze back to the Saint-Chamond. The last tank drove past them, a hint of disdain in his eyes. I won't change my mind. They're nothing but pretty faces. Charles smiled slightly and countered, tell me their weaknesses. Need you even mention them? Tigony rolled his eyes. The battlefield is the best proof, Brigadier General. They always get utterly defeated, they barely even get to the enemy. Charles replied, what if we don't need them to get to the enemy? Tigony laughed. If they don't need to get to the enemy, what kind of tank is it? Tanks are meant to tear through enemy lines. They need to be able to get to the enemy, cross trenches, and even have speed and defense, none of which the Saint-Chamond possesses. Charles countered, why can't it be artillery, General? Chapter 400 Seal's birthday. Artillery, Tigony chuckled. What a joke, it's clearly a tank. Before he could finish, Tigony understood Charles's meaning, and his smile froze. If it wasn't suitable as a tank, why couldn't it be used as artillery? Charles continued, artillery can follow behind the troops, General, with a range of 8 kilometers. That means it can follow 8 kilometers behind the attack line. Tigony nodded slowly. That way, its poor mobility won't be too much of a problem. Only when the Saint-Chamond charges like a tank will it get stuck in a small shell crater. If it advances 8 kilometers behind, there's plenty of time to avoid it. Charles nodded and added, we can also eliminate its machine guns. Tigony exclaimed, 4 fewer machine guns and 4 machine gunners not only reduces weight but also creates a lot more space. Yes, General, Charles said, don't just focus on its shortcomings, think about the advantages of using it instead of artillery. Reminded by Charles, Tigony finally began to truly compare the Saint-Chamond to artillery. The difference was immediately apparent. Tigony stared blankly at Char, saying uncertainly, Saint-Chamond is self-propelled and doesn't require frequent gun repositioning, meaning it has higher mobility for short-term relocation. Char nodded. The Saint-Chamond could fire and move at will, which meant safety for artillery. It has armor, so even if shells explode nearby, it's difficult to kill the gun crew, Char agreed. At this time, artillery accuracy was low, especially long-range artillery beyond visual range. Direct hits were rare, and injuries mainly relied on shrapnel or shockwaves. The Saint-Chamond's armor, however, could withstand most of the danger. It can also carry more shells, providing continuous and stable fire support for friendly forces. This was determined by the Saint-Chamond's internal space and payload capacity. Finally, Charles summarized, we've always been at a disadvantage in artillery, General. The Germans have an absolute numerical advantage in 105mm guns, and we can't change that in a short time. So, that's why we desperately need this armor gun. Tigony suddenly realized. Although its range and power are far inferior to the German 105mm guns, it has the potential to defeat them. Because the Saint-Chamond has advantages in armor and speed, as long as it isn't directly hit by enemy artillery, it has a chance to get close to the enemy's 105mm guns. Charles was somewhat surprised that Tigony could understand the advantages of the Saint-Chamond so quickly. He had originally thought that Tigony, this rich second generation, wouldn't put effort into improving his professional skills, but now it seemed that Tigony had indeed invested his heart in his art of war. Looking at the thoughtful Tigony, Charles asked, now, are you still planning to exchange Charles A1 for Saint-Chamond? Tigony smiled awkwardly and replied, you're right, no. Although Tigony wasn't sure if it was feasible, it was a new tactic worth trying, and Tigony never refused new tactics. However, Tigony added, Commodore, but shouldn't we replenish our Charles A1 supplies? Charles stared at Tigony in disbelief. Who would have thought this guy resembled the First Lord of the Admiralty? Was he his long-lost illegitimate son? June 12th was Charles's birthday. As an active-duty Commodore, he shouldn't have a birthday, much less a day off. Every soldier in the unit had a birthday. And if everyone had a day off, the unit would be in chaos. But Gallieni granted Charles a special day off that afternoon. There's no other reason, Brigadier General, Gallieni explained. It has nothing to do with your birthday. It's because you got Italy into the Allied powers, which is a remarkable achievement. They also awarded you a medal, Just pick it up when you pass by headquarters. Yes, General, Charles replied. He was quite surprised. Why would this old man care about his birthday? Although it could be found in the records, Galleri had thousands of subordinates, he was probably already numb to the number of birthdays. The medal was a war cross, which had only been established 2 months prior, and at this time only 10 people could receive it. Charles was fortunate enough to be one of them. The image above shows the French War Cross from World War I, awarded to individuals or teams for bravery in combat. If a team received the medal, it would be awarded to the unit's commander. Brownie was the 11th person to receive the medal. He was awarded it as the commander of the 1st Tank Brigade in recognition of the unit's outstanding performance at Cambrai. Charles casually put the medal in his pocket and got into the car returning to Darvez. In his eyes, the medal was probably less valuable than a day's vacation. When Charles arrived home, it was just getting dark. The town's lights were twinkling, and the noise was gradually subsiding, with only the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. Camille had prepared a table of dishes, baked a cake, and prepared candles after receiving a call beforehand. Djoko had also returned early. But that wasn't the main point. There were 2 more people at the table, a middle-aged woman and what appeared to be her daughter. Charles looked at Djoko with a puzzled expression. Djoko shrugged and glanced at Camille, who was carrying dishes out of the kitchen. Charles then understood, this was Camille's idea. This is Elisa, Camille introduced with a smile, placing a plate of roasted snails on the table. She's Aunt Lena's daughter, you must have met her before. Snails were a dish Charles disliked, so Camille didn't often cook them. Today must be for special guests. Hello, Charles. Elisa rose gracefully and shook hands with Charles. You might not remember, but we were classmates in junior high. Really? Charles truly didn't remember. This little girl wasn't nervous at all in front of him in his military uniform, which even bore the rank of brigadier general with 2 stars. She definitely wouldn't recognize him, Charles thought. Of course, Elisa laughed heartily. You must have been 14 back then, and Mr. Lewis always made you stand as punishment. Mr. Lewis was Charles's math teacher, and he always used this method to discipline students who hadn't finished their homework. Camille stared wide-eyed at Charles. How come I've never heard you mention this before? Charles looked utterly dejected. Mom, this is my last secret. Laughter erupted from the dining table. Charles glanced at Elisa with slight embarrassment. He thought of Lucia. Many people in Paris already knew she was Charles's girlfriend, but clearly, the news hadn't spread to the town of Davies yet. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.